What if your most important thoughts vanish, not because you're distracted, but because your brain is trying to protect you? Imagine you're mid-sentence, reaching for a profound idea, and suddenly, it's gone. Not lost, but scrubbed, deleted by your own mind like a self-erasing file. This isn't laziness. This is survival. Neuroscientists have uncovered that the brain isn't just a storage device, it's a threat detection system. Certain thoughts, especially those linked to emotional pain, trauma, or unresolved conflict, can light up brain regions like the amygdala, which processes fear. The moment this happens, your brain deploys a quiet form of censorship. It erases the path, mid-thought, to avoid destabilizing you. Think of a soldier who forgets the sound of the explosion that killed his friend, or someone who can't recall large portions of childhood abuse. Even ordinary moments follow this logic, like when you suddenly blank out during an argument, or when trying to remember why someone makes you uncomfortable. This isn't forgetfulness, it's neurological shielding, a kind of firewall built to prevent emotional overload. The limbic system pulls the plug, reroutes your focus, and rewrites the moment in real time. It's not conscious. It's instinct. You don't choose to forget. Your mind chooses for you. So when your mind blanks, it's not failure. It's a hidden intelligence, a defense mechanism older than language. Your brain isn't betraying you. It's shielding you from something it believes you're not ready to face. Memory doesn't just record life. Sometimes it chooses silence to preserve it. And that silence, it's the echo of your survival. What if you've never truly smiled for yourself? Imagine stepping into a room where the energy is unreadable, where every expression feels like a test. Without even thinking, you mirror someone. A polite grin, a tilted brow, a nod that doesn't belong to you. It's not pretense, it's protection. Your body chooses safety before your mind can speak. This is micro-expression mimicry, a scientific, unconscious response. NAS. Your mirror neurons, buried deep in the brain, instantly reflect the tiniest facial movements of those around you, not because you're weak, but because you're wired to survive. It's the same instinct that helps babies connect to mothers, and the same one that helps adults blend into dangerous rooms. Your nervous system reads the atmosphere like a radar. If the room feels unstable, your face adjusts. Small shifts in muscle tension, subtle mimicry of emotion. You don't decide to do it. Your body does it for you. Fast, automatic, and invisible. You're not faking. You're translating. Matching tone for tone, micro-expression for micro-expression. In boardrooms, at family gatherings, in schools where being different meant being targeted. You borrow their face so you don't have to reveal your own. You camouflage as belonging. But what's the cost? The more you mirror, the more your own expression fades. Over time, you forget what your own face looks like when it isn't responding to threat, when it isn't masking fear, when it isn't auditioning for approval. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. But awareness is the first reversal. What if you could build a life that doesn't demand mimicry to be accepted? What if your own face was safe to show? Because you weren't born to vanish behind borrowed expressions. You were born to be seen. Imagine your instincts aren't instincts at all, but the silent bleeding of unspoken memories, hidden in mental boxes you never labeled. Deep in your brain, your hippocampus and amygdala store experiences, especially traumatic ones, not just as facts, but as emotions. When trauma overwhelms your conscious mind, the brain does something protective. It doesn't delete the memory, it seals it. No words, no timestamps, just raw feeling. These sealed boxes sit quietly until something in the present mimics the pain of the past. A smell, a voice, a glance, and suddenly your body reacts. Your heart races, your stomach knots. You call it anxiety, but it's memory without narrative. Neuroscientists call this implicit emotional memory. You might not recall the fight, but your nervous system does. A child who flinched at slammed doors may tense up at closing cabinets for life. It's not irrational, it's survival. Now picture millions of these silent files, memories stored without permission, resurfacing without context. You think you're overreacting, but your brain thinks it's under siege. This is why healing isn't always about remembering, it's about naming. Giving shape to the nameless lets you regain control. The body keeps the score, and unlabeled pain acts out in instinct. But when you open the box, when you finally read the file, something changes. Reaction becomes awareness, fear becomes history, and you, at last, reclaim the narrative you never got to finish. Last, become someone new, not ruled by buried reactions, but guided by conscious understanding. This is not weakness, this is neurological truth. We are shaped not only by what we remember, but also by what we survive without remembering. You're not broken, you're encrypted, and healing is the slow process of decoding who you were so you can finally become who you are. Imagine walking into a room, smiling, laughing, saying, "I'm fine," while your heartbeat is racing and your chest feels tight. This isn't just social behavior, it's psychological armor. In neuroscience, this is known as emotional masking, a defense mechanism rooted in the brain's limbic system. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for social reasoning, overrides raw emotional signals to maintain safety in groups. You act normal, not because you are, but because your nervous system detects threat in being real. Studies in trauma psychology show that individuals with high anxiety or PTSD often perform normalcy to avoid scrutiny. A smile becomes a shield. Small talk becomes camouflage. It's not deception, it's preservation. Even children in unstable homes learn this early. They monitor tone, mimic calm, and rehearse fine until it's instinct. But this performance is exhausting. The autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic branch, stays activated, fueling cortisol production. Over time, pretending to be okay rewires your stress response. You stop recognizing what calm really feels like. You become fluent in normal, but forget the language of peace. You smile while your insides scream. You nod politely while your mind begs for silence. You laugh to survive. You pretend because honesty feels dangerous. So next time someone says, "I'm fine," listen for the tremble beneath it. We've built a society where invisibility is safer than truth. But what if we made space for the real answer? What if normal wasn't the goal, but healing was? What if your panic didn't need to wear a costume anymore? What if the chill you feel before breaking down isn't weakness, but a final act of survival? Imagine your nervous system as a city facing blackout. When emotional intensity rises beyond tolerance, your brain doesn't fight, it locks down. That numbness, the sudden cold in your chest or limbs, isn't failure. It's your last line of defense. In moments of overwhelming stress, your body activates the dorsal vagal complex, a system evolved to shut things down when threat exceeds capacity. Blood retreats to vital organs. Skin cools. Muscles freeze. It's called vasoconstriction, a narrowing of blood vessels to preserve your core. That icy sensation isn't dramatic metaphor, it's measurable. Trauma researchers link cold, pale skin to emotional shutdown. It's how your body avoids overheating from internal overload. Think of survivors of war, of abuse, of accidents, those who describe going cold just before collapsing. Their bodies weren't broken, they were buffering. Scientists now believe emotional coldness before a breakdown is a protective override, a neural pause button pressed when reality is too much. You're not weak. You're in lockdown, protecting the very parts of you that still want to heal. So next time your hands go cold before tears fall, remember, you're not failing to feel. You're conserving power for the moment it's safe to come back online. The cold is your body whispering, "Hold on, I've got you." What if your brain listens to danger before it even hears the words? Imagine talking to someone and feeling your chest tighten, not from what they say, but how they say it. A split-second pause, a subtle shift in pitch, a breath that drags half a second too long. You feel something's off, and science says you're right. The human brain is hardwired for microtone surveillance. We unconsciously scan voice tones for emotional threat. before logic ever kicks in. Evolution taught us that danger often hides between the lines. Our ancestors didn't survive by waiting for a lion to roar. They noticed the rustle, the breathless stillness, the tension in the air. Modern neuroscience confirms this. The auditory cortex picks up not just words, but their emotional weight. A sarcastic tone, an aggressive undertone, a cold pause, they light up your amygdala like an alarm bell. And it's often involuntary. You may walk away from a conversation feeling shaken, confused why you're on edge, because your brain caught a threat you never consciously heard. It happens in relationships, in workplaces, in everyday encounters. You ask a question, and the tone you get back isn't neutral. It's laced with dominance or dismissal. No insults needed. Your body reads the warning and tenses. We've evolved to be emotional radar systems. Language is only a mask. The voice tone, the microsyllables, the tempo, the tension, those are the true signals. So if your gut reacts before your mind can explain it, listen closer. There may be a storm hiding in the silence between their words. Microtone surveillance is survival, and your instincts have been decoding voices longer than you've known how to speak. What if your ambition isn't real? Imagine chasing a goal with everything you have, only to realize halfway through that you never actually wanted it. You just needed something to run toward so you wouldn't fall apart standing still. That's what false goal creation is. A survival instinct, a distraction dressed as purpose, something to fixate on so you don't have to feel what's underneath. You invent a goal, not because it lights you up, but because the silence beneath your drive is terrifying. The moment you stop moving, the fear rushes in. Fear of meaninglessness, of worthlessness, of staring into the void and realizing you don't know who you are without momentum. So you set the next goal, and the next. You stay busy. You chase. You build a ladder in the dark and climb. And sometimes you even succeed. You get the job, the title, the status. But when you arrive, it's hollow. The applause dies quickly. The joy feels faint, because it was never about the goal. It was about avoiding collapse. You weren't running toward something. You were running from yourself. Psychologists call this displacement motivation, a coping mechanism that redirects your energy away from emotional wounds towards socially acceptable pursuits. Work, fitness, accolades. It feels like progress. It looks like ambition. But it's really armor. And the longer you wear it, the heavier it gets. You are not broken for needing protection, but you are allowed to stop, to question, to sit in the stillness long enough to ask, who set this goal? Who is it really for? Because beneath the chase is something quieter, truer, a calling not invented out of fear, but remembered out of freedom. And that's the goal worth following, the one that calls you home to yourself, not away from your pain. What if the thoughts you replay after every conversation aren't about correcting mistakes, but avoiding the emotions beneath them? Imagine saying something awkward or too vulnerable. Later, your mind loops it like a scratched record, repeating the sentence, tone, pause. But why? It feels like analysis. In reality, it's avoidance. Neuroscience reveals that emotional discomfort triggers the brain's default mode network, activating internal narratives that offer distraction, not clarity. You're not seeking truth, you're seeking emotional distance. This isn't just overthinking, it's a neurological defense mechanism. When the amygdala senses emotional threat, shame, regret, embarrassment, it kicks the prefrontal cortex into overdrive. You dissect the moment not to solve it, but to numb it. Repetition becomes anesthesia, like rubbing a bruise to avoid the deep ache underneath. Have you ever replayed an argument and imagined better comebacks? That's not growth, it's grief management. The brain edits the past to shield the heart from the sting of powerlessness. This loop isn't logical, it's emotional camouflage. You whisper new versions of the moment, hoping they'll hurt less than the original. Even silence gets dissected. Should I have said more? Was that weird? These aren't questions, they're shields. Because facing the truth, that you felt too exposed, too raw, is harder than rerunning the scene again, so the loop becomes your lullaby, comforting but false. But here's the twist. Healing doesn't come from reruns, it comes from feeling. The next time the loop begins, pause. Don't fix it. Feel it, because what you're looping on might not be what you regret. It might be where you hurt, and pain, when faced, can become understanding. What if leaving wasn't just a thought, but your mind's full-time rehearsal? Imagine you're safe. Nothing is chasing you. No one is yelling. You're loved, you're fed, and the doors are unlocked. But still, your brain keeps scanning the exits. In traffic, you picture veering off and never returning. In conversation, you quietly time your escape. In relationships, you imagine vanishing without a trace. It's not about wanting to leave. It's about never learning how to stay, because somewhere deep inside, your body still believes escape is the only way to survive. Psychologists call this mental reflex preemptive disengagement. It's a survival mechanism often formed in people who grew up in unstable environments, where love was conditional, peace was temporary, and safety was always fragile. When you live in constant alert, the brain adapts. It learns to imagine exits, even where there are none, and eventually, those imagined exits become comforting. This is tied to the brain's default mode network, the system that activates when the mind is at rest. For trauma survivors, this resting state doesn't bring calm. It brings strategy, escape fantasies, emotional rehearsals. fMRI scans show these neural circuits lighting up in people with PTSD or complex trauma, revealing that their minds simulate leaving even during moments of peace. You daydream about bus stations, new identities, forgotten towns. You mentally pack your bags mid-conversation. You're always half gone, just in case. But even when the threat is gone, the habit stays. The body remains on edge. The heart hesitates. Relationships suffer, not from conflict, but from absence. So ask yourself, are you truly unsafe, or just trapped in the shadow of your own survival script? What if self-destruction isn't weakness, but a calculated form of survival? Imagine you're standing in a life that's quietly coming undone. The career you spent years building is slipping away. The love you thought would last begins to fracture. Your friends feel distant. Your dreams feel outdated. You feel helpless, adrift in your own story. And then, almost without thinking, you sabotage it. Not by mistake, but with eerie precision. Because if you destroy it yourself, at least you keep a shred of power. At least it ends on your terms. Psychologists call this behavior self-handicapping. It's not laziness, it's a strategy. If you ruin it, then failure isn't a judgment on your worth. The student who parties the night before exams, the artist who hides their best work, the partner who cheats before they get too close. These aren't just bad decisions, they're fear responses dressed as control. They're a way to avoid vulnerability by choosing defeat before it chooses you. Neurological studies show that the amygdala, the brain's fear center, activates intensely when we feel powerless. Cortisol surges, rational thinking narrows, but taking any action, even destructive, can trick the brain into feeling in charge again. Implosion becomes soothing, sabotage becomes safety. You didn't fail. You made the call. Many trauma survivors know this cycle intimately. When the world has taught you that nothing stable stays, destroying it yourself feels like foresight. But it's not strength. It's the illusion of safety that leaves only wreckage behind. So ask yourself, are you truly in control, or just too scared to find out what might happen if you let it live? Imagine you could slow time, not by controlling the clock, but by tricking the brain that reads it. In moments of trauma, your brain records more detail per second, making time feel like it stretches. But this isn't magic, it's neuroscience. When adrenaline spikes, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, encoding every movement, every sound. Later, those dense memories make the event feel longer in retrospect. This is why near-death experiences seem to unfold in slow motion. But what if we could reverse engineer that effect? When you're overwhelmed or stuck in monotony, your brain compresses time. Whole hours vanish in what feels like minutes. So we instinctively touch objects, slow our breathing, or break a routine, not randomly, but to anchor ourselves. Every new sensation forces the brain to pay attention. The unfamiliar stretches perception. A cold glass, the feel of a stone, the breath held a second longer than needed. Each detail forces the mind to record, and time seems to slow. It's why travel feels longer than routine. The first day in a new city feels infinite. But the commute to work? A blur. Novelty expands subjective time. Familiarity shrinks it. So, in moments when life feels too fast or numb, you touch the world with intention. You whisper to your brain, record this, and it listens. You can't bend time, but you can bend attention. And in that space, between one breath and the next, you reclaim moments that would have slipped away, forgotten, inside the rush. Time doesn't move at a constant pace inside your head. It's elastic, shaped by awareness. This is why children feel summers last forever. But as we age, the mind automates. Days blur. The only way to reclaim time is to disrupt that automation. Walk a new route. Eat slowly. The brain stretches time when the moment feels alive. Make it matter. What if the version of you that speaks in certain rooms isn't fake, but armored? Imagine walking into a space where one wrong look, one misplaced word, could change how safe you are. So you adjust, you smile more, you speak less, you read the air, but beneath it all, you're not being deceptive, you're surviving. Psychology calls it adaptive self-monitoring. Your brain scans for threat, and in milliseconds, shifts tone, posture, even vocabulary. This isn't people-pleasing. It's neurological protection. The cortex maps safety. The body follows. This identity shift is common in children raised around instability or emotional unpredictability. If love came with conditions, quietness, perfection, humor, then becoming those things felt safer than being yourself. Over time, you forgot where the performance ended and you began. That's not weakness. That's resilience carved into your behavior. You shapeshift because you learned early that who you are might not be enough to be safe in that moment, in that room, with that person. Imagine dating someone who lashes out when you speak freely. Slowly, you adapt, using fewer words, hiding opinions, laughing at what hurts. You're not losing yourself. You're storing yourself somewhere safe until it's okay to return. And yet, every adaptation leaves a scar, small but cumulative. You become fluent in becoming invisible. The tragedy is, most don't even notice they're shifting. They just call it being easygoing, or chill, or low drama. But those are just masks worn by people trained to preempt danger with a smile. Healing begins when you recognize the performance and give yourself permission to stop rehearsing. What if your survival didn't depend on what people said, but how they said it? Imagine you're in a room full of conversations. Words swirl around you, but your focus isn't on content. It's on cadence, breath, and the subtle tension behind each syllable. Long before we formed language, our ancestors listened for tone to sense danger. That ancient skill never left. You feel it now when someone says, "I'm fine," too quickly, with a clipped edge. Your body tightens, your brain flags it. Because evolution taught us that tone reveals truth faster than meaning. It's called prosody recognition, the brain's ability to decode emotional tone, and it's processed in areas far older than language itself. Even infants respond more to a voice's melody than to any specific word. In trauma survivors, this ability often becomes heightened, turning everyday speech into a constant scan for threat. You might not remember what someone said, but you remember how it felt. Because your nervous system doesn't care about grammar. It reads intent, fear, dominance, love, all hiding beneath the surface. This is why sarcasm stings, why monotone alarms you, why a kind whisper calms more than 1,000 reassurances. You don't hear language, you survive it. Beneath every sentence is a signal. and sometimes the quietest tones scream the loudest. Imagine training your heart to whisper instead of sing. That's what the withhold joy mechanism does. It's a psychological reflex rooted in fear. The less joy you allow yourself to feel, the less there is to lose. It's not weakness, it's survival. The brain, scarred by past pain, wires itself to anticipate loss. And when happiness feels like a setup for heartbreak, it begins to dim itself in advance. This isn't just a metaphor. Neuroimaging studies show that people who've endured trauma, loss, abandonment, emotional neglect, often have suppressed activity in their brain's reward centers. The amygdala, hypervigilant, links even joy with potential danger. That birthday party, that unexpected compliment, they're triggers for anxiety, not celebration. Because joy now carries a shadow. In psychology, it's a form of anticipatory grief. You start mourning the ending before the joy even begins. Soldiers returning from war, abuse survivors, children from chaotic homes, many instinctively mute their happiness. It becomes a ritual. Don't laugh too hard. Don't love too much. Don't hope too openly. If you feel less, you lose less. Even small joys, sunlight through a window, a song that stirs something, are filtered through suspicion. Will it be taken away? Will this hurt more if I enjoy it now? But the irony is brutal. By silencing joy, you feel the loss anyway, just sooner, and with no memory of warmth to soften it. You grieve a life you never fully lived. Now picture this. What if the safety you seek in muting joy is the very thing stealing your peace? What if fear of the fall is keeping you from ever taking flight? Maybe joy doesn't guarantee pain, but the absence of joy guarantees numbness. And numbness isn't safety, it's slow disappearance. What if your sense of purpose isn't a noble calling, but a quiet emergency reflex? Imagine being surrounded by chaos, everything you trusted collapsing. The human brain doesn't pause for accuracy. It reaches for coherence, and when the world spins, meaning is the anchor, even if it's imaginary. This is called existential attribution, and it's not rare. It's neurological armor. Cognitive studies reveal that unpredictability threatens our sense of self, triggering the brain to invent structure, not to enlighten us, but to keep us from fracturing. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, observed that those who created meaning, even in the darkest camps, survived longer. It wasn't truth that saved them. It was the illusion of a reason to endure. After tragedies, we say things like, "It made me stronger," or "It happened for a reason." These aren't conclusions. They're shields. The psyche prefers false order over true randomness. Even conspiracy theories provide psychological shelter. In terrifying uncertainty, it's comforting to believe someone is in control, even if they're sinister, because helplessness is more unbearable than lies. Your mind doesn't ask, "Is this real?" It asks, "Can I survive this narrative?" So next time your thoughts reach for a reason behind the chaos, pause. Is it truth you're holding, or scaffolding built to stop the fall? What if the reason you touch your sleeve, rub your face, or fidget with your keys isn't a habit, but an ancient survival signal? In moments of stress or dissociation, the brain can detach from the body. You feel unreal, floaty, like you're watching life happen through glass. This isn't imagination. It's a neurological defense called depersonalization, often triggered by trauma, anxiety, or sensory overload. So the body responds with anchors. Tiny gestures like feeling the edge of your phone or the warmth of your palm tell the brain, "I exist. I'm here. This is my skin." It's called somatosensory grounding. When your nervous system is flooded, touch bypasses the noise. It reboots presence. Your skin is filled with mechanoreceptors, nerve endings built to register pressure, texture, temperature. They send data faster than thought. Think about how soldiers grip gear in high-stress zones, how someone in grief clutches a coat, how children hold on to blankets. That's not weakness, it's primal intelligence. When language and logic fail, the body speaks in sensation. In psychiatric hospitals, grounding objects are given to patients, not as toys, but as stabilizers. Smooth stones, textured bands, rubber objects, tactile memory grounds the mind. So the next time your fingers twitch or your hand reaches for something solid, don't dismiss it. You're not fidgeting, you're surviving. You're re-entering your own skin. Grounding isn't weakness, it's an ancient ritual of return. A silent mantra written in fingertips. I'm still here. This moment is real. My body remembers, even when my mind forgets. Even in a digital world, the analog truth remains. Touch is the first language. It forms in infancy and endures through every age. Your body is not just a vessel, it's a transmitter of safety. To grip, to hold, to press your thumb into your palm is to declare presence. You exist, not in thought alone, but in sensation. Grounding is proof you're still real. What if your mind doesn't wait for pain, but previews it like a movie trailer? Imagine sitting quietly, then suddenly replaying a fight that hasn't happened yet. Words you haven't said, reactions they haven't made, but the heartbreak feels real. It's not anxiety without purpose, it's emotional rehearsal. Neuroscience shows that the brain's simulation of pain, especially social or emotional pain, activates the same neural circuits as real experience. So your mind rehearses the collapse, hoping to soften the impact when it actually comes. This habit often forms in people who've been hurt without warning. If betrayal or rejection came suddenly, your brain adapts by forecasting every possibility, especially the worst ones. That's not paranoia. It's your nervous system trying to preload suffering in manageable doses. Because pain rehearsed is pain reduced, or so the brain believes. You imagine being ghosted before it happens. You picture their silence, their cold eyes, the moment they say, I don't love you anymore. It hasn't happened, but you live it anyway. And sometimes, the rehearsal hurts more than the event. This coping mechanism comes at a cost. Constantly pre-living heartbreak means you never experience peace in the present. You flinch before anyone lifts a hand. You cry before anyone walks away. You bleed from wounds that don't yet exist. But here's the truth. Anticipating pain doesn't stop it. It just makes you live it twice. What if, instead of rehearsing tragedy, you rehearsed your own strength? Not escape routes, but resilience. Because when the hurt does come, and sometimes it will, you deserve to meet it fully alive, not already broken by its echo. What if the version of you that speaks at 2 a.m. isn't the real you, but just the exhausted one wearing your face? Imagine lying in bed, mind spinning, body hollow. Every flaw you've ever carried rises like a ghost. Every insecurity feels like a prophecy. You think it's clarity, but it's chemical. When you're fatigued, your brain rewires its priorities. The amygdala, the fear center, fires harder, reacting to emotional triggers like they're threats. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for reason and restraint, dims its influence. That imbalance creates a distorted filter. Sadness deepens, regret loops, hope vanishes. You begin to trust your worst-case scenarios, not because they're true, but because your brain can no longer weigh possibility with perspective. It's a survival glitch, your system interpreting exhaustion as a cue for hyper-awareness. You mistake it for honesty because it feels raw, but raw isn't always real. At night, when energy is gone and defenses are low, the shadows get louder. You're not broken, you're just tired. Let the version of you that believes in healing speak in the morning. Let rest rewrite what fatigue tried to narrate. What if your memory isn't a record, but a story you keep editing to survive? The brain doesn't store the past like a video. It rewrites it like a screenplay, adjusting the facts to protect your identity. Neuroscientists call this memory reconsolidation. Every time you recall an experience, your brain makes a new version of it. This isn't failure, it's adaptation. You soften your role in a fight. You downplay how much it hurt, or maybe you exaggerate the pain so no one minimizes it again. Over time, the memory stops being what happened and starts being what helps you endure. It's not about accuracy, it's about survival. The hippocampus retrieves memory, but the prefrontal cortex reshapes it, molding your narrative to match who you need to be. Victims of trauma often remember events differently over time. This isn't lying, it's psychological defense. Memory distortion protects the mind from collapse. You'll say, "It wasn't that bad," to keep functioning, or "It ruined me," to explain why you feel broken. Neither is pure truth. Both are emotional translations. Even family stories get rewritten. Siblings recall the same night in opposite ways. That's not deceit. It's perspective filtered through emotion, shame, or hope. Memory isn't static. It's reactive. It listens to who you are now and rewrites the past accordingly. But awareness is power. When you notice the edits, you gain clarity. You can choose to stop protecting the wound and start healing it. Memory may lie to help you survive, but truth helps you live. This is why two people can leave the same relationship with completely different stories, because memory doesn't reflect the event, it reflects the emotion left behind. And when emotions evolve, so does the memory. You might forget details that don't support your current self-image, or add meaning that never existed, just to make sense of your journey. These are not flaws in cognition. They're survival mechanisms of a brain that refuses to be destroyed by its own past. What if looking away isn't shyness, but a defense, refined in silence? Imagine being young in a world where one wrong stare could spark punishment, suspicion, or pain. Your brain, flooded with fear, learns that safety lives in what you don't look at. Eye contact stops being connection. It becomes exposure. And if you've been wounded, that exposure feels like standing naked in fire. So you look down. Not because you're weak, but because your nervous system is trained to survive. Studies show that the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, fires more intensely in trauma survivors during direct eye contact. The brain isn't misfiring, it's shielding. That momentary glance carries risk of being read, misunderstood, challenged. And so, the eyes lower, not out of shame, but calculation. Glance deflection becomes armor. A subtle, "don't see me." Children raised in unsafe environments master this. They track danger from the side, reading chaos like weather, while staying invisible. That survival mechanism doesn't vanish with age. It follows into adulthood, into meetings, dates, moments of intimacy. You're not avoiding someone. You're protecting a boundary so deep, even you might forget it's there. So the next time your gaze slips away, don't rush to label it fear. Sometimes it's memory, a reflex passed down from pain, a blink-shaped boundary, a shield you learn to wear with your eyes. What if your smile isn't happiness, but camouflage? A signal not of joy, but of defense. We are taught early that smiling makes us acceptable, likable, safe. But behind many grins lies a shield, a reflex to avoid conflict, suspicion, or deeper questions. Psychologists call it surface acting, where emotional expressions don't match internal feelings. It's survival, especially in environments where showing pain feels dangerous. Your nervous system learns that a smile can disarm aggression. In a hostile home, a child smiles to soothe a parent's rage. In the workplace, a smile can deflect attention from burnout. On the street, a smile keeps strangers from looking too closely. It's not deception, it's strategy. The face becomes a mask the brain wears for safety, and over time, it sticks. Studies show people who fake positive expressions under stress experience emotional exhaustion. Their cortisol rises, their empathy drops, because pretending costs energy. And when smiling becomes armor, we lose track of what joy actually feels like. The grin becomes habitual, even automatic. You laugh when nervous. You smile during grief. And the world praises your strength, unaware they're admiring your shield, not your soul. But sometimes, behind closed doors, the mask slips. Your face softens and the body exhales. That's when you meet yourself again. So the next time you smile and feel emptiness beneath it, pause. That's not failure, it's a clue. Your body is trying to protect you the only way it knows how. Even armor made of kindness is still armor. And even warriors need rest. Social smiling, often praised as politeness, can become chronic masking. We smile to avoid questions, to appear in control, to dodge pity. But the body knows the truth. Muscles ache. The jaw stiffens. Over time, that pleasant expression becomes an invisible burden. Smiling isn't always light. It can be a lifelong performance, a gentle armor, a soft disguise. What if some people don't fear losing love? They test it to feel if it's real. Imagine pushing someone away, not because you want them gone, but because you're terrified they'll leave anyway. So you break something on purpose. You say the thing, start the fight, create distance, all while watching closely. Will they come back? This isn't manipulation. It's a defense born from emotional trauma. Psychology calls it an attachment test. When love has been conditional, earned, or yanked away without warning, your mind builds small detonators just to see who survives the blast. It begins young. If affection was given and then withdrawn, if love was stormy, unpredictable, you learn to test every bond before you trust it. You pull the thread to see if it holds. And if it snaps? At least you were right. At least the disappointment came on your terms. The pain is preemptive. You sabotage because staying open feels more dangerous than being alone. It's not that you want them to leave. You just need to know they'll stay even when you're unlovable, because part of you believes you are. Imagine texting something passive-aggressive, then staring at the screen, hoping they'll fight for you, or going silent, praying they'll break the quiet. These aren't games. They're desperate attempts to feel secure in chaos. Because when someone stays after you've pushed, they pass a secret test your heart never stops giving. But here's the truth. Love isn't proven by surviving destruction. It's revealed in safety. The real courage isn't breaking things to test love. It's letting things stay whole and believing you're already worth staying for. What if your suffering isn't random, but chosen again and again because it's familiar? The brain craves patterns, even if they hurt. New pain is unpredictable. It feels dangerous, unmeasured, chaotic. But old pain? That's a story you know by heart. It might bruise, but it doesn't surprise you. In psychology, this is known as the repetition compulsion, a phenomenon where people unconsciously return to familiar emotional wounds even when they long to heal. Children raised in environments of criticism often grow into adults who chase approval from those least likely to give it, not because they enjoy rejection, but because the emotional blueprint feels like home. The nervous system equates familiarity with safety, even if the outcome is harmful. Your brain would rather replay an old trauma than risk the instability of something unknown. This is why people stay in toxic relationships, why they sabotage peace, why comfort feels uncomfortable. Because new joy demands a rewrite of your identity. It forces your body to sit in calm without flinching, to accept love without suspicion. That's terrifying when your biology was trained for survival, not serenity. But recognizing the pattern is power. The next time you feel drawn toward the same fight, the same ache, the same disappointment, pause. Ask yourself, is this pain real or just remembered? Is this love or just the shape of something I survived? You don't have to keep choosing the wound just because it's shaped like home. You can leave, you can rewire, and you can build new blueprints, ones that don't hurt to live in. The brain doesn't seek peace, it seeks prediction. And when pain becomes predictable, it becomes a comfort zone. Familiar wounds don't heal, they repeat. But when you break the pattern, when you choose something kind, it will feel wrong at first. That's not failure, that's rewiring. It takes time to believe that ease doesn't mean danger, and that love can exist without pain. What if your ambition isn't about success, but escape? Imagine waking up every day, chasing goals with fire, but beneath it, there's no joy, only motion. You check tasks off the list. You move faster, push harder. But it's not growth, it's distraction. A quiet avoidance, because stillness would mean facing the ache underneath. Psychologists call this avoidant productivity, where effort masks emptiness. The brain learns to convert emotional discomfort into action, not reflection. Because if you're always moving, you never have to sit with what hurts. This hustle is worshipped in modern culture. We admire the grind, but rarely ask what fuels it. For some, it's passion. For others, it's panic, unprocessed grief, chronic loneliness, fear of insignificance. So you build, achieve, win, but you never pause, because to stop would mean feeling the thing you buried so deep you forgot its name. Imagine someone who can't sit through a weekend without scheduling more, or someone who can't celebrate a win, just reaches for the next one. They're not chasing excellence. They're outrunning the silence. Work becomes a wall between them and their inner life, and the higher they build it, the more isolated they feel. But burnout isn't just exhaustion, it's emotional malnutrition. It's the soul starving in a life full of motion. And sometimes it takes collapse to finally hear the quiet ache you've been running from. What if success isn't the goal, but peace? What if your worth doesn't come from what you finish, but from who you are when you stop? The ache doesn't go away through achievement, it only heals through attention. Maybe the next milestone isn't forward, but inward. What if your deepest fears aren't yours, but echoes from generations before you? Imagine being terrified of abandonment, even in a safe relationship, or constantly scanning for danger in calm rooms. It doesn't make sense until you realize your body remembers things your mind was never told. These are inherited survival scripts. Epigenetics reveals that trauma can leave chemical marks on DNA, passed down like warnings carved into the blueprint of your body. Your hypervigilance might be your grandmother's war. Your fear of scarcity could be your grandfather's hunger. This isn't superstition, it's science. Studies on Holocaust survivors' descendants show altered stress hormone levels, even if they never lived through war. Children of famine survivors often carry metabolic adaptations to scarcity. Your anxiety may be a torch, lit long before you were born, handed to you by those who ran through fire so you could exist. You flinch before the blow ever comes. You apologize before you've done anything wrong. You sabotage peace because peace feels unfamiliar. That's not dysfunction. That's legacy. A script written by survival, not choice. Imagine fear passed down like a family recipe, not in words, but in silence. In the way your parent held their breath when the phone rang, in the way they always saved too much, trusted too little, loved too cautiously. You were shaped not just by what happened to you, but by what happened to everyone before you. But here's the truth. Inherited doesn't mean permanent. You can update the script. You can stop the loop. The fears you carry may not be yours, but the healing is. And rewriting the story is how you set the next generation free. What if the subtle flick of an eye or a pause in a reply feels like a prophecy, predicting rejection before it even arrives? This isn't mere paranoia. It's your brain's finely tuned survival system at work. Humans evolved to detect social threats early, scanning for micro-expressions and minute cues that hint at disapproval or exclusion. These split-second signals trigger a cascade in your amygdala, heightening anxiety and preparing you to protect yourself. But this hypervigilance can create a feedback loop. You become so attuned to rejection cues that even neutral gestures feel like judgment. The mind fills gaps with fears, confirming what it desperately hopes to avoid. Psychologists call this pattern recognition, but when it runs unchecked, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect rejection, act guarded, and unintentionally push others away, confirming your fears. Yet awareness offers freedom, recognizing that these flickers and pauses are often ambiguous, not absolute judgments, can loosen their grip. Your brain's prophecy is a prediction, not a decree. When you learn to question these signs instead of obeying them, you reclaim control. The flicker becomes a signal to pause, not to panic. And with practice, you can rewrite your script, transforming feared rejection into resilience and connection. Would you like me to prepare a full narration script with this? What if you turned to music not for pleasure, but because your body forgot its own feelings. Imagine the world around you muted, colorless, emotionless. You press play on a song you once loved, and suddenly tears you didn't know you were holding back break free. It isn't nostalgia, it's survival. Neuroscience shows that listening to emotionally charged melodies triggers your mirror neurons, reigniting feelings your brain has dampened. When trauma or depression suppresses your native emotional response, you borrow the intensity of lyrics, harmonies, and rhythms to feel alive again. This phenomenon isn't fantasy. Studies find that music activates the limbic system, the same structures that process genuine joy, sorrow, and love. In people with alexithymia who struggle to identify their own emotions, music becomes a translator. The crescendo of strings bypasses cognitive blockages, and your body remembers what it forgot. You aren't weak for needing an external spark, you're resourceful. Picture someone who hasn't cried in years until a melancholic piano chord strikes, or a heart so numb that only a soaring guitar solo can trigger goosebumps. You rewind the track again and again, chasing that moment when your chest finally pulses with feeling. Each replay isn't addiction. It's an attempt to revive parts of yourself that trauma stole. But borrowed emotions come with a cost. Relying solely on songs means you never learn to listen to your inner voice. The music becomes both friend and crutch. What if, instead of borrowing emotion, you learned to reclaim it? What if you used the spark from a song to ignite the fire within? Because the melody can guide you, but only you can sing your own soul's song. What if you find yourself choosing sadness, not because you want to suffer, but because it feels safer? Joy is unpredictable, fleeting, and vulnerable to loss. Sadness, on the other hand, is a known territory. It's steady, familiar, a quiet companion that doesn't abandon or surprise. The brain craves predictability, and when joy fades quickly, sadness lingers as a protective shield against the shock of happiness lost. Neuroscientifically, sadness activates brain regions involved in deep reflection and self-protection, like the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. This state slows you down, allowing for cautious processing. Joy triggers reward circuits that spike and drop, creating a roller coaster effect. When you've been hurt before, the brain learns to avoid the highs to protect against the inevitable lows. Psychologically, this preference for sadness over joy is a survival strategy, not a sign of weakness. It helps avoid emotional whiplash. People might even unconsciously seek sadness, maintaining it to prevent the chaos that unpredictable joy can bring. But while sadness feels safe, it also traps you in patterns that limit growth and healing. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward change. You don't have to choose between numbness and pain. You can learn to welcome joy with open arms, understanding its impermanence, but embracing its gift. Healing begins when you stop fearing the fleeting and start appreciating the moments that bring light, even if only briefly. What if the weight of being blamed feels safer than the clarity of not knowing? Imagine you make a mistake, a misstep in a conversation, a deadline missed, and your mind seizes on guilt like an anchor. Blame creates a narrative, I failed, but uncertainty whispers, it could be anything. Neuroscience suggests that ambiguity activates the brain's alarm system, flooding you with stress hormones. Yet blame triggers a predictability bias, a dopamine release in the striatum, as if owning fault were a reward. Guilt feels concrete. Uncertainty feels like falling into an endless void. Functional MRI scans reveal that when you assign blame, activity spikes in the anterior insula, linking guilt to visceral certainty, while ambiguity leaves that circuit silent and your mind adrift. This isn't self-punishment, it's survival logic carved into your neural pathways. In unpredictable environments, knowing you're wrong, even painfully, grounds you. Your amygdala learns that guilt is safer than the terror of the unknown. So you confess failures, assume responsibility, hold on to blame, because it's better than the endless questions. Guilt becomes stability. Have you ever preferred to take the blame for a group error or admitted fault before you fully understood the situation? That's not humility alone. It's an unconscious choice to feel stable rather than suspended in doubt. You'd rather be wrong than adrift because guilt feels like home. But here's the truth: guilt never frees you. It only cements you to past patterns and painful cycles. What if you replaced blame with curiosity? What if you allowed uncertainty to be your teacher rather than your enemy? The path to stability isn't in being wrong, but in embracing not knowing. And it's there you find true ground, built not on guilt, but on growth. What if your mind keeps running disaster simulations not because you're pessimistic, but because pain you plan feels less cruel than pain that blindsides you? The brain craves control. When faced with uncertainty, it constructs worst-case scenarios, preparing you emotionally for the storm before it hits. This mental rehearsal is a survival tactic rooted deep in evolution, designed to reduce shock and heighten readiness. Neuroscience shows that the prefrontal cortex engages in this anticipatory thinking, activating stress responses early to minimize damage. But when disaster simulation becomes a habit, your brain is trapped in a loop of anxiety, constantly predicting threats that may never come. This chronic alertness drains emotional energy and clouds your ability to experience peace. Psychologically, imagining chaos feels like armor. It transforms helplessness into preparedness, giving you a false sense of control over unpredictable pain. But ironically, this habit often amplifies suffering because anticipating disaster can overshadow moments of calm and joy. The key lies in balance. Awareness that your mind is simulating pain allows you to step back. You can choose when to prepare and when to live fully in the present, because real strength isn't in fearing the storm, it's in dancing in the rain despite it. What if your apologies aren't kindness, but a way to make yourself disappear? Imagine entering a room and saying sorry before you even speak your mind. Your voice softens, shoulders slump, words shrink. You apologize to preempt criticism, to blend into the background, to take up less space. Neuroscience shows that social threat triggers the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, activating self-monitoring circuits that heighten self-criticism. Apologizing floods your brain with cortisol, dulling assertion and confidence. This habit often begins in childhood in families where speaking up brought reprimand or withdrawal. A casual remark could trigger anger, silence, or disapproval. Over time, your brain learned to stay safe, shrink. That apology becomes a shield and a noose, protection and erasure in one breath. Functional MRI scans reveal increased connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and fear centers whenever you self-blame, wiring apology into your stress response. Picture a workplace where you offer ideas, then immediately apologize for their flaws. Or imagine telling a partner your feelings and following with, "I'm sorry if this upsets you," as if caring itself were criminal. You minimize success. "Sorry I can't do more." "Sorry if my work isn't perfect," even when praised. These sorries build a pattern of self-erasure, convincing you that taking space is stealing. But here's the truth: space isn't theft. Your presence isn't a burden. The next time you say sorry for no reason, pause. Feel the urge, then assert yourself. Speak without shrinking. Replace the apology with confidence. "Thank you for listening. I need this space," because making space for yourself isn't aggression, it's essential. Your voice deserves its full volume, and your life demands that you stand tall, not disappear. What if the urge to help isn't just kindness, but a way to keep people close? When you give to others, you're not only offering support, you're building invisible tethers, binding them emotionally to you. This sense of being needed creates a feeling of importance and connection, but it can also blur the lines between genuine love and dependency. Neuroscientifically, acts of giving trigger dopamine release in the brain's reward centers, reinforcing the behavior. Yet, when helping becomes a way to secure attachment rather than altruism, it can foster unhealthy relationships where love is conditional on dependence. Psychologically, dependency masquerades as love because it feels safe. Being needed provides reassurance, reducing anxiety about abandonment. But this safety can trap both giver and receiver in patterns of control and obligation, preventing true intimacy and growth. Awareness is the first step to breaking free. Recognizing that love thrives on freedom, not chains, allows you to nurture relationships based on mutual respect and independence. Helping from a place of abundance, not need, creates bonds that uplift rather than bind. What if the quiet around you isn't peace, but a spotlight on every uneasy thought you've tried to swallow? Imagine sitting in stillness, and suddenly your mind launches a barrage. Memories you tucked away, worries you numbed out, fears you muted with noise. The silence becomes deafening, so you fill it. Music, podcasts, scrolling feeds, anything to drown the echo of your own mind. Neuroscience reveals that when sensory input drops, the default mode network lights up, amplifying self-talk and emotional shadows trapped beneath consciousness. This silence aversion reflex often develops when inner turmoil felt unbearable. If vulnerability meant judgment or pain, you learned to avoid the space where your feelings surfaced. Noise becomes your shield. It masks the heartbeat beneath the chest, the tremble beneath the voice. Each notification pings like a lifeline, pulling you away from the chasm of introspection and into momentary calm. Picture someone who leaves the TV on in empty rooms, who plays white noise to fall asleep, who scrolls through social media in every spare moment. They talk over silences in conversations, interrupting pauses before they can think. These aren't harmless habits, they're attempts to block the echo chamber inside. Each distraction is a lifeline thrown to a self that would collapse under the weight of its own thoughts. But here's the insight. Stillness isn't your enemy, it's a mirror. When you finally stop the noise, your mind greets you with what it has waited years to say. The shadows in the silence are not monsters, they're messages. The next time you feel the urge to fill silence, pause. Breathe into the quiet. Notice the thoughts without fighting them, because only by facing the noise within can you learn to sit with peace. And sometimes the calm you avoid is the healing you need. What if your mind is constantly doing emotional math, tracking who texts first, who forgets, who doesn't notice, not with numbers, but with feelings? This silent scorekeeping isn't about petty grudges, but a subconscious effort to balance connection and protect yourself. Your brain catalogs every social exchange, weighing actions against expectations, building an internal ledger of who's present and who's absent. Psychologists describe this as relational monitoring, where you measure the give and take to assess trust and commitment. When the balance feels off, when one person always reaches out or remembers, it triggers a subtle sense of unfairness or rejection. Over time, these small calculations influence how safe and valued you feel. Neurologically, this process involves the prefrontal cortex managing social cognition and the amygdala processing emotional responses. The more emotionally invested you are, the more intense the mental math becomes, sometimes leading to anxiety or resentment if the score seems skewed. But awareness of this pattern can free you. Recognizing when you're tallying scores allows you to reset expectations and communicate openly. Emotional math isn't about winning or losing, it's about finding harmony. And harmony grows when you let go of rigid counting and embrace the unpredictable flow of human connection. What if your relentless quest for knowledge isn't just curiosity? It's armor. You learn endlessly, not just to grow, but to shield yourself from the sting of feeling ignorant or vulnerable. The brain craves competence because feeling stupid triggers threat responses in the amygdala, igniting anxiety and self-doubt. This pursuit becomes a defense mechanism. By accumulating facts, skills, or credentials, you build a fortress against judgment, rejection, or failure. Psychologists call this intellectual compensation, where knowledge masks insecurities and creates a sense of control. Yet, this shield can isolate. The fear of appearing uninformed may prevent asking questions or admitting uncertainty, both vital for true growth. Over time, the endless learning can become exhausting, and the pressure to know everything turns joy into obligation. Awareness is key. Recognizing that knowledge isn't a weapon but a tool opens space for vulnerability and authentic connection. Real strength isn't knowing it all, it's embracing what you don't. When you let go of the need to prove yourself, learning becomes liberation, not defense. What if your heart goes numb before you can trust it? Imagine affection feels like stepping onto thin ice. Any warmth threatens to crack you open, so you play it cold. You keep your distance, clip your voice, let your eyes wander away. Emotional freeze mode is your brain's refuge when love equaled danger. Your nervous system learned to shut down heat. Warmth triggered threat responses, so you built a wall of ice. Neuroscience shows that chronic relational trauma recalibrates the amygdala and insula, causing hypervigilance and blunted oxytocin release. In fMRI scans, loving faces light up fear circuits, not reward centers. Your body treats touch like a phantom limb, familiar yet alien. Each hug feels like an intrusion, each compliment like a test you can't pass. This habit often begins in childhood when caregivers were unpredictable. Warmth came with strings, love for obedience, praise for silence. You learned that feeling safe required smelling the cold air before you could breathe, so you primed your heart to freeze at the first sign of closeness, preserving safety at the cost of connection. Picture someone who stiffens at tenderness, who responds to a gentle word with silence, who chooses solitude over the risk of softening. It's not indifference, it's a defense carved into neurons by years of frost. Every thaw attempt triggers cortisol spikes, reminding you why ice felt easier than heartbreak. But here's the revelation: ice can melt. True safety rewires the brain. In relationships where vulnerability met compassion, oxytocin pathways rekindle warmth. You learn that not every touch breaks you, that some hands carry the heat of genuine care. Healing begins when you let curiosity rise above fear, when you let yourself feel even a fraction of warmth, because the barrier was never you, it was the fear that you didn't deserve to melt. What if imagining death isn't morbid obsession, but a quiet rehearsal for the inevitable? Your mind runs through scenes of loss, not from fear, but from a deep instinct to prepare emotionally. Psychologists call this anticipatory grief, a process where envisioning absence helps soften its impact, allowing you to cope better when it arrives. Neuroscience reveals that this mental rehearsal activates brain regions responsible for emotional regulation and memory consolidation. By imagining loss, your brain practices processing grief in advance, building resilience. It's like mental training, gradually accepting the reality of mortality to reduce shock. Culturally, many traditions embrace death visualization as a spiritual practice, understanding that confronting mortality fosters presence and gratitude. This preparation isn't about inviting sadness, it's about strengthening your emotional muscles to face life's greatest challenge with grace. Yet, this habit walks a fine line. Too much rehearsal can spiral into anxiety, but balanced awareness offers peace. By imagining the end, you learn to cherish the moment, love deeply, and live fully, turning death from a looming shadow into a teacher of life's true value. What if your body reads the silence as a lie before your mind can catch up? Imagine standing in a hushed room, notes of tension vibrating in the air, and you sense betrayal. Even though everyone's quiet, your chest tightens, your pupils dilate, your muscles coil. You haven't heard a threat, but your sympathetic nervous system has, fight or flight firing before thought forms. This threat perception override is your brain's hypervigilant defense when danger once came without warning. The superior colliculus catalogs sudden shifts in sensory input, triggering a cascade faster than your conscious mind can process. This mechanism saved ancestors from stealth predators and silent adversaries. But when it's rewired by trauma, every pause can feel like a trap. fMRI studies show that in people with PTSD or betrayal trauma, silent faces activate fear circuits more than angry ones. The insula monitors internal state, and the anterior cingulate monitors conflict. Together, they hijack rational cortex, flipping the body's alarm switch in milliseconds. You tense at minor cues, a glance held too long, a throat cleared without sound, perceiving threat where none was intended. You start predicting the silent stab. In meetings, you perceive betrayal in colleagues' quiet listening. In relationships, you feel accused by an unspoken glance. You avoid calm gatherings, chasing noise to drown the signal your body insists is danger. Each override chips away at trust, replacing curiosity with suspicion. But here's the breakthrough. You can retrain the override. Mindfulness-based therapies and trauma-sensitive yoga teach your brain to pause before alarm. Exposure to neutral silence, practiced in safety, weakens the false trigger. Because the body's response can be edited, you can reclaim silence not as threat, but as space to think, connect, and breathe. What if the power of delay isn't just impatience, but a calculated move? When you withhold messages or pause before replying, you're not just waiting, you're subtly tipping the emotional scales. The silence becomes a tool, shifting control and influence in the delicate dance of human connection. Neuroscience shows that anticipation intensifies emotions. The brain's reward system lights up with dopamine not just from receiving a message, but from the suspense before it. By delaying, you heighten the other person's attention and desire, creating a sense of importance and intrigue. Psychologically, withholding can build tension, foster curiosity, and signal boundaries. But it's a double-edged sword. Overuse risks miscommunication, anxiety, or mistrust. The key lies in intention, using pause to create space, not silence to manipulate. Awareness transforms delay from a power play into a mindful pause. It becomes a way to balance vulnerability with self-respect, connection with autonomy. When wielded wisely, waiting is not weakness. It's the quiet strength that shapes relationships. What if your solitude isn't tranquility, but a trophy of survival? Imagine drawing into yourself, shutting out the world, and wearing isolation like armor. You tell yourself, I can handle this alone. But the silence you sought for strength also echoes your deepest fears. Neuroscience finds that social connection triggers dopamine and oxytocin, feeding emotional regulation. Remove it, and your brain's reward centers go quiet, leaving emptiness that whispers, you don't belong. Loneliness spikes cortisol, amplifying stress circuits and cementing isolation into your neural pathways. This self-imposed exile often begins after betrayal or profound disappointment. If relying on others meant pain, you learn to trust only yourself. So you shrink your circle, cancel plans, retreat into work, sidestep invitations. Each step away feels like power, proof that you need no one. Yet every locked door also seals out comfort, empathy, and understanding. Over time, your neural pathways encode isolation as safety, making closeness feel risky, even dangerous. Picture someone who turns down invitations, works late alone, and greets morning coffee solo. They call it independence, but underneath is a varicose ache, a reminder that distance prevents hurt, but heightens loneliness. The longer you stay apart, the louder the silence screams for connection, as your insula and anterior cingulate light up at the absence of social cues. But here's the paradox. True resilience isn't built in voids. It grows in the space between hearts. The same neural circuits that protect you in solitude also need others to flourish. Healing begins when you risk reaching out, sharing vulnerability, and listening with openness. Let the quiet between words become a bridge, not a barrier. Because strength isn't measured by how long you stand alone, but by how bravely you stand together, supported by the pulse of human connection. What if a single moment could echo through every day of your life? Imagine a trauma so searing that your nervous system marks its arrival like a timestamp, and every year, every month, every day, every hour, your body flinches when it reappears. Time-based trauma tracking is your brain's way of encoding survival signals into the clock. Your hippocampus logs not just events, but their temporal coordinates. When the hour of the original wound returns, your body relives the alarm. Neuroscience reveals that the interaction between the amygdala and hippocampus binds emotional intensity to temporal memory. In PTSD, the locus coeruleus floods the brain with norepinephrine at the moment of trauma, potentiating synapses that encode both the fear and the timestamp. Years later, that hour acts like a trigger. Your heart races, muscles tense, cortisol surges, even if the world around you is calm. This mechanism once saved lives. If danger struck at dawn, remembering dawn equals threat kept you alive. But when the threat was human cruelty or accident, the imprisoned pattern haunts you. You check the clock anxiously when the hands match that moment. You avoid schedules that mirror that time. You plan your life around a trauma anniversary you never signed up for. Picture standing in line at a coffee shop when the barista looks at the clock and announces the time. Your stomach lurches. A sense of dread washes over you before you realize why. It's the hour the world changed. The trauma returns not as memory, but as a physical reflex, marked in milliseconds. But here's the breakthrough. Retraining the temporal association can free you. Therapies like time-based exposure gradually weaken the link between clock and trauma. By reliving the context in safe intervals, you unbind fear from the hour. Healing isn't erasing the past, it's loosening its grip on time so you can live each moment unbound. What if you find yourself staring into mirrors, not just to check your appearance, but to confirm you exist? This act isn't vanity, but a profound search for reality when your sense of self feels fragile or fragmented. Neuroscience shows that our brains rely on sensory feedback, like reflections, to anchor identity. Yet sometimes, the reflection feels alien, distorted, or disconnected because dissociation or anxiety disrupts self-recognition. This uneasy gaze triggers a feedback loop. You seek proof of reality, but the more you look, the more distorted your perception becomes. The mirror becomes a paradox, a source of truth that feels like deception. Psychologists explain this as a dissociative experience where mind and body feel separate, challenging the brain's integrated sense of self. Yet this mirror check is also a coping tool. It's your brain's way of reaching for stability, an attempt to ground fragmented identity. Over time, with awareness, you can learn to trust your internal sense of self beyond reflections. The mirror then shifts from a battleground to a bridge, a reminder that reality is not only what you see, but what you feel inside. What if your laughter is a shield rather than joy? Imagine tension rising in a room, the air thick with unspoken dread, and you crack a joke, not to entertain, but to deflect the scream beneath. Humor before breakdown is your brain's emergency valve, releasing pressure before it bursts. Neuroscience shows that laughter triggers endorphin release in the anterior cingulate cortex, momentarily masking pain signals from the amygdala. Functional MRI scans reveal that in those with trauma, comedic timing activates prefrontal regions that overwrite distress networks, granting temporary relief. This habit often forms when vulnerability felt unbearable. If crying led to judgment, punishment, or abandonment, your brain learned to preempt sorrow with wit. You become the class clown, the quick quip in meetings, the light comment at dinner. Each punchline is a barrier, buying you seconds before the emotional dam floods, rerouting distress into punchy one-liners. Picture someone who laughs through serious conversations, injecting levity when tears threaten. Or someone who deflects heartfelt questions with self-deprecating humor, saying, "I'm fine," with a grin. It isn't charm, it's crisis management. You dilute raw feeling with laughter, ensuring no one sees the fracture behind the facade. Over time, this reflex becomes automatic. Mirror neurons fire, making others laugh and rewarding you with social approval, reinforcing the habit. But the internal alarm never sleeps. Behind every laugh, there's a muted whimper, a paused sob waiting for permission to surface. But here's the paradox. Humor does heal when shared, weaving connection through laughter. Yet when it's automatic armor, it isolates. If every joy is a weapon against your own pain, You never learn to face the noise within. Healing begins when you let the laughter pause, when you allow the silent scream to be heard. Because you don't always need a punchline, sometimes you just need to be held. What if you create deadlines not to manage tasks, but to ignite a spark you've long since lost? Imagine your ambition has grown numb, each morning a routine of half-hearted checkboxes. So, you invent urgency, a self-imposed deadline, flashing reminders, intense bursts of energy that jolt you into motion. This isn't mere procrastination turned pressure, it's a survival hack. Neuroscience shows that acute stress spikes norepinephrine in the locus coeruleus, sharpening focus and motivation. You become your own crisis. This deadline as fuel reflex often forms when intrinsic drive falters. If passion once burned bright but later felt extinguished, your brain learned to manufacture crisis to feel alive. You set today-only goals, color-code calendars, draft impossibly tight timelines, all to chase the adrenaline shot that breaks through paralysis. Each countdown is a lifeline thrown across the void of apathy. Studies on timed tasks reveal that under perceived time pressure, the prefrontal cortex lights up, enhancing working memory and decision-making. You harness this chemistry, using artificial urgency to summon bursts of productivity. Yet the cost is exhaustion. Chronic stress reshapes the HPA axis, leaving you wired for panic and depleted of genuine enthusiasm. Picture someone who thrives on last-minute sprints, whose best work emerges when the clock threatens midnight. They never celebrate early wins, just stare at the ticking timer until it screams the final minute. They fuel inspiration with deadlines, mistaking pressure for purpose. But here's the insight. True motivation isn't sustained by perpetual crisis. It grows in calm intention, fueled by curiosity and meaning. What if, instead of inventing deadlines, you rediscovered why you started? What if you cultivated steady engagement rather than jolts of panic? Because lasting drive isn't sparked by fear of time, it's kindled by the fire of passion, burning at its own pace. Imagine receiving praise for a job well done, then deflecting it with a casual, "It was nothing." You sell your wins short, fearing that owning them invites envy or a fall from grace. Neuroscience reveals that the nucleus accumbens releases dopamine on success, yet self-deprecation activates prefrontal circuits that dampen that reward, keeping your ambition in check. This reflex often emerges where success was punished or exploited. If achievement drew backlash, envy, or unbearable expectations, your brain learned to downshift victories. You master understatement, turning promotion into just more work, recasting high grades as lucky guesses, presenting accolades as mere team effort. Each minimization is a way to stay invisible, avoiding the spotlight you believe might burn you. Imagine an artist who calls a masterpiece just a sketch, a leader who describes a breakthrough strategy as no big deal, or someone who shrugs off applause, whispering, "I don't deserve this." These aren't humble statements, they're shields. You protect yourself from believing that admitting success means bearing its burden, soaring expectations, fear of failure, or the sting of pride before a fall. But dampening achievement robs you of growth. Dopamine cements memory and fuels motivation. Without celebration, your drive withers. When you downplay wins, you teach your brain that victories are unworthy of joy, dimming your confidence and stalling progress. What if you reclaimed your victories not as arrogance, but as milestones of growth? What if you allowed the full surge of triumph to energize your next challenge? Because acknowledging success doesn't tempt fate, it equips you to shape it. What if stepping back isn't avoidance, but the only way to hear yourself think? Imagine the world's noise pounding your mind, opinions, obligations, interruptions, and no volume button to turn it down. So you withdraw into solitude, not to hide, but to quiet the static inside your head. Isolation for regulation is your brain's control panel. You unplug from external inputs to reboot internal balance. Neuroscience shows that sensory overload floods the prefrontal cortex, impairing decision-making and emotional control until the noise drowns out reason. This habit often begins when overwhelm felt suffocating. If boundaries were ignored or stress unrelenting, your nervous system learned to seek sanctuary in emptiness. You close doors, mute notifications, retreat from gatherings. Each moment alone is a reset. Your brain lowers cortisol, restores dopamine sensitivity, and strengthens neural circuits for self-regulation and introspection. In solitude, you recalibrate until your thoughts no longer spin on autopilot. Picture someone who needs an hour of focused quiet before responding to messages, who takes midday walks alone to diffuse tension, who retreats to an empty room when emotions spike. They aren't running away, they're recharging. Brain imaging reveals that during self-chosen isolation, default mode network connectivity increases, supporting creativity and problem-solving when you eventually re-enter the social flow. But here's the insight. Regulation isn't isolation forever. It's a rhythm. Withdraw, then reconnect. Silence, then sound. Healing begins when you honor your need for quiet without letting it become a prison. Schedule solitude and social time like yin and yang, because shutting out the world allows you to tune into yourself, and when you return, you bring clarity instead of chaos. What if your stomach's rumble no longer calls for sustenance, but for relief from the churn of anxiety? Imagine sitting at a table laden with food and feeling no appetite, as though taking a bite would betray the turmoil inside. Hunger silences feeling. Your brain shuts down cravings when stress spikes, prioritizing threat response over nourishment. Neuroscience shows that cortisol and adrenaline flood your system under anxiety, inhibiting ghrelin secretion and blunting dopamine signals in reward pathways, rewiring your body to value survival over satisfaction. This reflex often develops when emotion felt too raw to digest. If eating was punished or ignored in moments of distress, snatched plates, shaming remarks, you learned to freeze appetite alongside feelings. So food becomes secondary. Your body denies hunger to deny pain. Meals turn into empty rituals, plates full yet hollow, as you starve both body and heart. Your vagus nerve quiets digestive signals, redirecting energy to hypervigilance and emotional numbing. Picture someone who skips lunch on high-stress days, not because they're dieting, but because eating feels like surrendering to vulnerability. They nibble at snacks anxiously, then push them away, convinced that feeling hunger is safer than feeling hurt. Each avoided meal is a silent pact with their own fear, reinforcing interoceptive disconnection and leaving wounds unhealed. But here's the paradox. Neglecting nourishment cuts off fuel for resilience. The same hormones that suppress hunger also deepen anxiety, creating a loop of fear and deprivation. Healing begins when you retrain your interoception. Notice hunger cues without judgment. What if you reframe meals as medicine? What if you let yourself eat even when anxiety screams otherwise? Because honoring hunger can become the first step to honoring your feelings and healing the knot of silence your body has tied. What if you wore music not just for pleasure, but as armor against the world? Imagine sliding headphones over your ears, then watching the noise of humanity fade to a distant buzz, replaced by curated beats. Headphones become your barrier. Sounds shield to cancel the unpredictable chaos of human contact. Neuroscience reveals that blocking external auditory input reduces activity in the superior temporal gyrus, dampening social cues and emotional resonance. With each decibel you dial up, your mirror neurons fire less, muting empathy signals at the neural level. This habit often forms when interactions overwhelm. If conversations felt intrusive, critical, or draining, your brain learned to seek refuge in predictable soundscapes. The locus coeruleus, which mediates arousal, responds to unexpected noise with spikes of norepinephrine. So you trade inhuman unpredictability for controlled auditory input. You curate playlists or podcasts that keep your limbic system humming, while the thrum of real voices is muted, crafting a private auditory sanctuary. Picture someone entering a crowded train, slipping on AirPods, and instantly cocooning in silence. The chatter, the coughs, The stray fragments of conversation, gone. They nod at no one, isolated by rhythms only they can hear. Each step through a social gauntlet becomes a private journey, a signal that their nervous system craves controlled stimuli over spontaneous interaction. But here's the paradox. Shielding yourself with headphones also mutes connection. Humans learn through subtle vocal inflections, breathing patterns, and pauses. When you cancel them, you trade social resonance for solitude. Chronic headphone use rewires attention networks, reinforcing withdrawal over engagement, and risking social atrophy as the brain deprioritizes external vocal cues. What if, instead of full silence, you balanced sound with presence? What if you let ambient voices filter through, reminding your brain that humanity's static can also be warmth? Because you can wear headphones as a shield, but true resilience comes from tuning in, not out. What if you didn't binge for pleasure, but to silence your inner monologue? Imagine turning on the TV, piling on snacks and noise, not for enjoyment, but to drown the commentary in your mind. That running narration, the doubts, regrets, fears, becomes unbearable in quiet. So you chase louder stimuli, shows, chips, podcasts. Binge to exit thought is your brain's emergency escape, trading internal noise for external distraction. Research shows self-generated thought lights up the default mode network and midline hubs tied to self-awareness and discomfort. When your own mind feels like a trap, you hijack dopamine circuits with novelty. The nucleus accumbens spikes with each cliffhanger and crunch, muting introspection. You consume noise to escape its source. This habit forms when overwhelm peaks. If facing your voice meant confronting trauma or anxiety, you learned to outsource attention. You scroll shows, snack down your plate, switch playlists, anything to keep silence at bay. Silence equals self-confrontation, so you fill every gap. Picture someone finishing a season overnight, never pausing, or devouring popcorn until the bowl is gone, even when full. They swap one narrative for another, preferring drama or sugary crunches over unfiltered thoughts. Each binge is an escape self. But here's the insight. You can learn to sit with your mind without fleeing. Mindfulness and brief scheduled pauses retrain the default mode network, letting you meet your inner narrative without overwhelm. Silence can become your ally, not your prison. What if, instead of exiting, you learn to navigate your own story? Because the voice inside can become the one you guide, not the one you fear. What if a calendar filled edge to edge isn't a badge of honor, but a fortress to avoid facing yourself? Imagine scheduling every minute, meetings, workouts, hobby classes, until your days are so full that by nightfall, your mind is too exhausted to question the questions that matter. Busyness as avoidance is your brain's refuge when existential dread looms too large. Cognitive science shows that an overloaded schedule floods the prefrontal cortex, leaving no bandwidth for introspection. You trade depth for distraction. This habit often forms when the truth feels unbearable. If silent moments unleashed overwhelming thoughts, your purpose, your fears, your mortality, you learned to flee into motion. Each appointment becomes a lifeline, each reminder a shield. Your notifications ping, and your to-do list grows, giving you permission not to pause. Because in constant activity, you never have to ask, who am I? What do I want? What am I missing? Neuroscience research reveals that chronic busyness elevates cortisol and adrenaline, keeping you wired for action and unable to sit with uncertainty. The default mode network, which underlies self-reflection, shrinks under perpetual task pursuit, replaced by the salience network that prioritizes external goals. You become a machine of achievements, safe from the edges of your own questions. Picture someone whose calendar is so packed they cancel vacations for more meetings, who schedules relaxation to the minute, and who fears an empty hour more than a looming deadline. They're not productive. They're perilously numb. Their ambition masks anxiety, and achievement becomes the only measure of worth. But here's the revelation. Life isn't proven by how busy you stay. It's measured by moments you truly live. Healing begins when you clear a blank space on your schedule and let stillness sit beside you. Because when you stop to breathe, the questions may come, and sometimes they are the answers you've been running from. What if sleep isn't an escape, but a stage for the conversations you never dared to have? Imagine closing your eyes, expecting rest, only to find your mind replaying arguments you avoided, words you left unsaid, voices you needed to confront. In REM sleep, when judgment circuits loosen and the amygdala kicks in, your subconscious seizes its chance. It resurrects unsafe exchanges, staging them in surreal scenes where familiar faces deliver lines you never dared speak. Research reveals that during REM, the default mode network merges memory fragments and emotions. The hippocampus stitches real moments with invented dialogue, while your speech centers buzz with bursts of activity, rehearsing what you couldn't say, even weaving new perspectives into those scenes. Neuroscientists using fMRI have observed Broca's and Wernicke's areas activate during these dreams. You aren't dreaming random images, you're running emotional simulations. Picture yourself in a dream debating a grievance you held back, your tone firm, your words precise, or rehearsing an apology you never offered, feeling the relief of being heard. You wake with your heart racing and the echo of your own voice still in your mind, proof that your psyche was hard at work. Rather than fear these dreams, lean into them. Journal the dialogue and note the feelings that surfaced. Try dream incubation. Set an intention before sleep to address that unresolved talk. Practice those words aloud in waking life. You'll empower your waking voice with the clarity your subconscious rehearsed. Because sleep disguises rest, but your mind never stops trying to truly finish the conversations you weren't safe enough to have while awake. What if your imagination wasn't an escape, but a lifeline? Imagine writing a poem so strange no one asks if you're okay, or inventing a story where the villain wears your pain, but no one notices it's you. This isn't deception, it's protection. Many people don't create to be seen. They create to stay hidden, to survive the truths they can't yet speak aloud. Psychologists call this expressive suppression through narrative displacement. In simple terms, you disguise your pain as fiction because it feels safer. Studies show trauma survivors often develop rich inner worlds, not just as fantasy, but as emotional filtration systems. The metaphors aren't random. They're pressure valves offering release without exposure or shame. You don't say, "I'm not okay." You write about a crumbling city, a lost planet, or a lonely god, and when someone praises the art, you feel seen without being exposed. Raw honesty feels like holding out your organs. But fiction? Fiction is armor made of metaphor, laced with just enough distance to let you breathe again. Storytelling activates the brain's default mode network, used in self-reflection and memory processing. So when you write, you're not avoiding your truth. You're translating it into a language your nervous system can handle. The page becomes a mirror with a filter, one that shields you from drowning in vulnerability. Think of the last joke you told that wasn't really a joke, or the sad story you gave a happy ending, because you needed one. That's not weakness. That's a survivor speaking in symbols, quietly telling the truth their voice can't carry. So next time you read someone's fiction, ask, what truth was too sharp to say aloud? What if you didn't just hear people? You scanned them like sonar. Imagine growing up where moods turned on a dime, where "I'm fine" could still mean danger. You'd stop trusting words and start decoding tone, silence, micropauses, the real language underneath. This isn't paranoia, it's precision. Studies show that people raised in emotionally volatile homes develop a hyperactive amygdala, trained to detect vocal shifts before the threat arrives. You learned to map safety not by content, but by vibration. Your ears became emotional instruments, tuned for conflict before it ever appeared. This habit, called emotional eavesdropping, is your nervous system's adaptation. It's why a sharp inhale feels louder than a scream, why a too long pause tells you more than a full sentence. It's not a flaw, it's fluency in emotional physics. Imagine someone saying, "It's okay," but their tone spikes slightly at the end. Your system catches it before your mind does. That's survival. That's calibration. You're not reading minds, you're forecasting storms. It's exhausting. You're the first to sense tension in a room, the last to believe words without music. You avoid loud people, not because you dislike noise, but because your inner world is already loud with calculation. You build relationships slowly, not because you fear closeness, but because you fear misreading it. You're not broken. You're just fluent in frequencies others never had to hear. And that fluency, it's not madness, it's mastery. What if the mirror isn't where vanity lives, but where old pain hides in plain sight? Imagine standing still, scanning your reflection, not to admire it, but to dissect it. That one uneven eyebrow, the skin under your eyes, the angle of your jaw. You fixate, not because you want to perfect it, but because your brain needs a controllable enemy. This is hyperfocus on flaws, and it's more common than you think. Psychologists call it a displacement behavior, when the emotional wounds we can't face latch onto something easier to criticize. You weren't born noticing asymmetry in your face. Somewhere along the way, the mind learned that pain without a name needs an outlet. And what's more available, more daily, than your own reflection? Every micro-judgment becomes a ritual of control in a world that feels chaotic. A scar might stand in for a betrayal, a blemish for loneliness. That curve of your body, it becomes the battleground for emotions you've buried too deep to label. Body dysmorphic disorder is one extreme on this spectrum, but even without diagnosis, millions unconsciously practice this behavior. After social rejection, after trauma, after silence, people zoom into their face as if the pain must be visible somewhere. It's not narcissism. It's a subconscious search for reason, a way to say, this is why they didn't love me. It creates the illusion of logic, a fake cause and effect the mind clings to. But healing doesn't come from pixel-level scrutiny. It comes from stepping back, emotionally and physically. From asking, not what's wrong with your face, but what happened to your heart. Only then can the reflection soften. Not because the features changed, but because the war behind them finally did. What if disappearing was your only way to stay kind? Imagine you're emotionally hollow. Every word feels heavy, every reply a lie. Someone texts you hoping for connection, but your inner world is static. Explaining this would mean unraveling pain you barely understand, so you vanish. Ghosting isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's a final act of kindness by someone too worn down to explain why they're gone. Neuroscience shows us that chronic emotional exhaustion, especially in those with high empathy, can trigger dissociation. Your prefrontal cortex shuts down. You don't think clearly. You freeze, not out of malice, but self-defense. Many who ghost have lived in survival mode for years. Childhood trauma, toxic relationships, grief. They teach the brain that silence is safer than vulnerability. The nervous system responds like it's in danger. Ghosting becomes an instinct, not a decision. Social psychologists now understand this as part of complex trauma behavior. It may seem heartless, but it's often the opposite. The ghost doesn't want to hurt you with half-hearted excuses or broken honesty, so they choose absence. In their mind, it feels gentler. Clinical psychologists refer to this as emotional shutdown, where your brain prioritizes detachment over confrontation. Think of the last time you ignored a message not out of arrogance, but because even typing back felt like dragging your skin across glass. That's not selfishness. That's someone trying not to bleed on the people they care about. So next time someone disappears, ask yourself, what storm were they drowning in that made silence seem like mercy? What if you don't take photos to remember, but to believe? Imagine smiling for the camera, surrounded by friends, laughter frozen in time. But inside, you feel distant, like you're watching someone else live your life. Later, you scroll through that photo, trying to convince yourself it was real, that you were there, that you felt something worth holding on to. This is more common than we admit. Psychologists refer to it as emotional dissonance. when your internal experience doesn't match the external moment. So you take a picture not to capture joy, but to record evidence. You're archiving proof for your future self who will question whether it ever truly happened. The smile was real, but the feeling wasn't. The lens saw what your body didn't fully feel. People with depression or anxiety often experience this emotional lag. The brain's reward system, especially the dopamine circuit, doesn't fire in sync with life events. You go through something beautiful and feel nothing. You smile, pose, celebrate, but it's like acting through fog. Later, the image becomes a touchstone, not just a memory, but a reassurance. See, it was good. I wasn't numb the whole time. Photos become external emotional memory, a gallery of feelings you hope to one day access. Neuropsychologists call this affective forecasting error. Your brain misjudging how you should feel in real time, so it compensates by documenting what it hopes will matter later. Think of your favorite photo. Do you remember the joy, or do you just believe it must have been there because the picture says so? What if the camera isn't saving your memories, but stitching together the feelings you couldn't feel in the moment? What if the things you never say are the real scaffolding holding you up? Imagine a life where sharing too much was once used against you, where honesty wasn't met with comfort but consequence, so you learned to armor yourself with silence, not to deceive, but to protect the fragile core that got hurt too many times. Secrets aren't always betrayals. Sometimes they're survival instincts, compressed, concealed truths kept in vaults your mind built after too many breaches. Psychologists call this adaptive concealment. It's a defense that forms when environments punish openness. Your brain learns that vulnerability doesn't guarantee connection, it guarantees risk. So you begin to curate yourself, offering versions instead of the whole. You become fluent in omission. You speak, but you never bleed. You connect, but never fully plug in. And no one notices, because you've made it look normal. You're open, but only in safe zones. You share facts, not fears. You offer stories, but never keys. Every conversation becomes a calculation. What do I give, and what do I keep? Because deep down, you've learned that exposure feels like danger, and withholding, it feels like control, like a tiny rebellion against a world that once left you defenseless. That's why being misunderstood feels safer than being fully known. That's why you smile when you want to scream. That's why you nod when your thoughts are screaming no. That's why silence is your sharpest shield. You're not hiding to lie. You're hiding to last. Because when truth once broke you, silence became the only thing that didn't leave a scar. And sometimes, holding back is the loudest way your heart says, I've survived. What if your calm during chaos isn't strength, but suppression on a time delay? Imagine a moment of crisis. Someone yells, something breaks, life cracks open. And you don't flinch. You stay composed. You handle logistics. You check on others. You say, I'm fine. But hours later, in the quiet, your hands shake, your chest tightens, you cry over nothing or everything. That's not weakness. It's the nervous system deferring the flood. This is called delayed emotional processing, a phenomenon linked to the brain's threat response wiring. In a crisis, your body prioritizes survival, mobilizing focus, shutting down emotion, storing reactions for later. Scientists point to the role of the amygdala and hippocampus. When you feel unsafe, your brain hoards feelings until safety returns, often mistaking stillness for safety. But here's the trap. Stillness doesn't always feel safe, so the feelings you stored come out crooked. Anger, where there was sadness, numbness, where there should be relief. You find yourself snapping at small things or zoning out in silence. It confuses people. It confuses you. Why now? You ask. Why here? The truth is, you weren't calm. You were postponing collapse. Soldiers experience it. First responders. Children of volatile households. Anyone conditioned to survive chaos without reacting. It's not emotional strength, it's emotional debt. The calm was real, but so is the interest it collects. The cost builds in your body, in your gut, your muscles, your breath, until a song or scent or silence detonates it. Healing starts not by suppressing the delay, but by noticing it, by learning your body's timing, by letting your nervous system know you're safe now, you can feel it all, you don't have to carry it forever. What if every unsent message you deleted was a timestamp of emotional survival? Imagine typing a truth so sharp it stings. Your hands tremble, your pulse quickens. But before it reaches the world, a deeper instinct pulls you back. You stare at the blinking cursor, then press delete. And just like that, the truth vanishes, replaced by a breath you didn't know you were holding. This isn't weakness. It's your nervous system in protection mode. Neuroscience shows that when we prepare to be vulnerable, the brain's anterior cingulate cortex lights up, signaling potential conflict. The amygdala, ever alert to social threat, floods your body with anxiety. To your brain, speaking your truth is as risky as standing unarmed in enemy territory. So, you don't send it. Not because you didn't mean it, but because somewhere in your past, truth was punished. Maybe you overshared once and were mocked. Or you opened up, only to be abandoned. These moments train your brain to associate expression with danger. You become fluent in silence. Drafts pile up, never delivered. It's not the words that are dangerous, it's the need behind them. Psychologists call this the text then delete reflex, a digital form of emotional repression. But what stays hidden doesn't disappear, it ferments. Suppressed emotion feeds anxiety, creates tension, rewires self-trust. You don't just delete messages, you begin deleting pieces of yourself. And soon, even in safe moments, you hesitate to speak, not out of choice but habit. So next time you type, and that old fear rises, pause, breathe. Maybe the message isn't just a risk. Maybe it's your rescue. Maybe choosing to be seen is how you finally heal. What if your smile wasn't joy, but a shield forged in chaos? Imagine a child growing up in a home where silence meant danger and footsteps signaled a storm. Every creak of the floorboard sharpened their instincts, and slowly they learned. Smiling made them smaller, safer, not because they were happy, but because it made them less of a target. This is the smile flinch reflex, an involuntary expression triggered not by happiness, but by hypervigilance. The amygdala fires, your mouth curves up, not to connect, but to survive. In trauma psychology, this pattern is well documented. People raised in emotionally unstable or threatening environments often train themselves, without realizing, to smile as a first line of defense. It's a survival mechanism, not a personality trait. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains how the nervous system prioritizes social cues to diffuse threats. When you lack safety, your body performs it. That's why people pleasers often smile in conflict, why survivors laugh while describing pain, why someone jokes at their own expense just to keep the air light. It's why your lips lift when your heart drops, why your expression softens when your spine stiffens. This reflex isn't weakness, it's brilliance under pressure. But brilliance forged in trauma can become a cage. Healing begins when you spot the smile that arrives too soon, when you pause and ask, not just what am I feeling, but who taught me to hide it behind a grin? And in that pause, there's power. Because recognizing the reflex is the first real rebellion. The moment your smile becomes yours again. You might notice it during a tense meeting, after a sharp comment, or when you're interrupted, but you still smile. Not because you're okay, but because long ago, your nervous system decided pretending was safer than being seen. And now, you're learning to be seen again. What if the real you was once punished so thoroughly that your mind decided to hide it for good? Imagine walking into a room and sensing exactly who they need you to be. You shift, subtly. You adjust your tone, your posture, your entire presence, not because you're fake, but because authenticity once cost you something you never got back. This is called fawning, a trauma response where safety is found in being agreeable, adaptable, invisible if necessary. It's not manipulation. It's survival. People who shapeshift like this are often praised for being easygoing, empathetic, or a great listener. But deep down, they're scanning, reading every microexpression, anticipating every reaction. Being liked feels like protection. Being rejected feels like danger. The chameleon learns early that their true colors invite harm. So they master masks instead. You tell jokes in one group and stay silent in another. You downplay your needs, your grief, even your joy, if it might upset the balance. Not out of deceit, but instinct. You remember the moment you were too much or not enough, and how fast love was withdrawn. So now you walk into rooms like mirrors, reflecting everyone else, disappearing into what's safe. But here's the tragedy. The longer you play every role, the harder it is to find your original face. The real you starts to feel distant, even to yourself. And being everything for everyone eventually means being nothing for yourself. You might even forget what you sound like when you're not performing. You didn't shapeshift for approval. You did it for safety. But you deserve to enter rooms without changing your shape at all. You deserve to stay. What if happiness doesn't feel safe? Imagine finally getting good news, an acceptance letter, a compliment, a moment of peace. But instead of celebration, you hesitate. You smile, but only half. You wait. Because you've learned that joy comes with consequences, that what rises falls. This is the delay joy reflex, when the nervous system has been trained to treat happiness not as a reward, but as a warning. It's a trauma response, deeply rooted in survival learning. If joy was once followed by loss, or praise followed by punishment, your brain forms an unconscious association. Happiness is a trap. So you pause, you mute your joy, not because you're ungrateful, but because your body is bracing for the backlash. Neurobiologically, the amygdala remains alert even in moments of safety. The nervous system doesn't relax just because the mind says it should. Children from chaotic homes often learn this early. A quiet evening might have preceded a storm. A proud moment might have led to jealousy or shame. The brain, in its protective wisdom, adapts. If you don't feel the high, you won't crash from it. You start calling it realism, humility, even maturity. But often, it's fear disguised as wisdom. You delay joy so you can stay in control, so you won't be blindsided again. But you lose something in the process: spontaneity, celebration, connection. Over time, that delay becomes default. You don't even realize you're holding your breath every time something good happens. Healing begins with recognizing that joy is not a lie. It's not a setup. It's a signal that something good is happening, and you deserve to feel it in real time, not just in hindsight. The moment is now. Let it rise, and don't apologize if it shines too bright. What if every time you wanted to speak your truth, your brain launched a full internal emergency protocol? Imagine standing in front of someone you trust, or want to trust. A moment of silence stretches, inviting you to say what's real. But before you can speak, your mind runs a simulation. What's the risk of rejection? Will they understand? What if they laugh, walk away, use it against you? This is emotional risk assessment, a reflex built from years of navigating vulnerability in unsafe terrain. The brain treats honesty like a gamble. Calculate the odds or stay silent. Neurologically, the prefrontal cortex lights up when we anticipate sharing something personal. It weighs possible social outcomes like a high-stakes chess game. Studies in affective neuroscience show that people who've experienced betrayal or emotional neglect develop heightened activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the region tied to conflict detection. It's not just overthinking, it's the brain protecting what's left. The body stalls. The throat tightens. Words hover at the edge of your teeth, but the gate never lifts. This is why many people say, "I'm fine," when they're breaking. Why a confession gets replaced by a joke. Why a boundary turns into silence. It's not avoidance. It's architecture. Safety, exit routes, outcome scenarios, all calculated before the heart can speak. But healing begins the moment you notice the pause, when you catch the calculation mid-run and decide, I'll speak anyway. Not because it's safe, but because silence has cost me too much. Vulnerability then becomes rebellion, and a map to something truer. Even small truths, like saying, that hurt me, or I need help, can feel like walking into fire. But that fire burns away only the lies. What's left is you, raw, honest, and unhidden. And sometimes, that's how you finally feel real. What if your mind keeps replaying a moment not because it mattered, but because it's a decoy? Imagine obsessing over that awkward thing you said in passing, the misplaced laugh, or the time you waved and they didn't see. These aren't significant events, but your brain loops them like urgent alarms. Why? Because it's safer to fixate on the small than to face what's larger, unspeakable. Neuroscience calls it maladaptive rumination, a mental trap where emotional processing short circuits. Studies show that individuals with high anxiety or past trauma often hyperfocus on minor social errors as a subconscious coping strategy. It's a form of memory camouflage, where your attention gets stuck in the surface to avoid the depth beneath it. You can't control the loop, because the loop is control. It gives you something to fix, somewhere to put the fear. Like a pressure valve, your brain chooses precision over pain. A loop feels manageable. A broken heart doesn't. That's why many trauma survivors seem perfectionistic or hyper-aware of social blunders. It's not vanity. It's a defense mechanism coded by experience. When survival once depended on emotional attunement, overthinking became armor. A misstep becomes a mirror, and you stare, hoping that if you replay it enough, you'll rewrite something deeper. But you won't, because healing doesn't live in the loop. So the next time your mind replays a harmless moment with crushing weight, ask yourself, not what did I do, but what am I avoiding? That question isn't weakness, it's a key. Because once you see the loop, you can step outside it. And that's when healing begins, not as a single act, but as a series of braver choices in a mind finally ready to rest, not run. What if your mind keeps replaying a moment not because it mattered, but because it's a decoy? Imagine obsessing over that awkward thing you said in passing, the misplaced laugh, or the time you waved and they didn't see. These aren't significant events, but your brain loops them like urgent alarms. Why? Because it's safer to fixate on the small than to face what's larger, unspeakable. Neuroscience calls it maladaptive rumination, a mental trap where emotional processing short circuits. Studies show that individuals with high anxiety or past trauma often hyperfocus on minor social errors as a subconscious coping strategy. It's a form of memory camouflage, where your attention gets stuck in the surface to avoid the depth beneath it. You can't control the loop, because the loop is control. It gives you something to fix, somewhere to put the fear. Like a pressure valve, your brain chooses precision over pain. A loop feels manageable. A broken heart doesn't. That's why many trauma survivors seem perfectionistic or hyper-aware of social blunders. It's not vanity. It's a defense mechanism coded by experience. When survival once depended on emotional attunement, overthinking became armor. A misstep becomes a mirror, and you stare, hoping that if you replay it enough, you'll rewrite something deeper. But you won't, because healing doesn't live in the loop. So the next time your mind replays a harmless moment with crushing weight, ask yourself, not what did I do, but what am I avoiding? That question isn't weakness, it's a key. Because once you see the loop, you can step outside it. And that's when healing begins, not as a single act, but as a series of braver choices in a mind finally ready to rest, not run. Emotional lottery behavior. What if kindness was never just kindness, but a wager? Imagine being someone who offers help, affection, forgiveness, not because you expect it back, but because deep down, there's a quiet, aching hope. Maybe this time, someone will stay. Emotional lottery behavior isn't manipulation, it's a trauma-born gamble. You give and give, not for applause or attention, but for the rare and fragile chance that one connection might not vanish like the rest. Psychologists call this an echo of attachment trauma, when love came in bursts or not at all. Your nervous system learned that presence was earned, not given. So you overfunction. You pour yourself out. Acts of kindness, deep listening, undeserved forgiveness, not for return, but as tickets in an invisible lottery where the prize is simple, not being abandoned. You tell yourself it's fine, that giving is its own reward. But deep down, every act carries a question. Will this be the one? The one who doesn't leave when things get quiet, the one who sees you not for what you do, but who you are. You remember the silence after vulnerability, the birthdays forgotten, the texts unanswered, the warmth that turned cold without warning. Still, you keep showing up. You keep loving, even when it's thankless. Not because you're naive, but because your heart has always held more hope than it should. And the worst part, sometimes they stay. Just long enough to deepen the wound when they eventually go. You're not broken for wanting to be chosen. You're just exhausted from trying to earn what should have always been yours. And that exhaustion, it means your love was real, even if theirs wasn't. And that truth, it still matters. So do you. What if memory isn't just a recording, but a negotiation? Imagine recalling a painful moment, an argument, a betrayal, a failure. The story rises like smoke, but something's changed. A line is missing. A detail is blurred. You tell it again and again, slightly edited each time. Not to deceive others, but to protect yourself. This is retelling as rewiring. It's not lying, it's survival through narrative. Neuroscience shows that memory is reconstructive, not static. Each time you remember, the brain doesn't simply replay, it rebuilds. And during that rebuild, emotions, context, and current beliefs shape the story. The hippocampus and amygdala work together, allowing fear to fade or guilt to soften. Painful memories are rewritten, gently, with subtle turns of phrase. A fight becomes a misunderstanding. A rejection becomes redirection. A wound becomes a scar, then a lesson. This isn't manipulation, it's healing. When the original story feels too sharp, the brain protects you by layering meaning over it. People who've experienced trauma often reshape their past, not to escape reality, but to gain agency within it. A child who felt abandoned might later say their parent did the best they could, not because it's fully true, but because it hurts less than believing they weren't worth staying for. Over time, retelling creates internal safety. The story stops being a trap and becomes a bridge, a way forward. Truth evolves into what we can carry. And sometimes, softness is survival. So if you notice yourself rewriting history, pause. You're not being dishonest. You're showing yourself mercy in the only language your nervous system understands, story. And maybe, in that mercy, the real you finds a place to begin again, with truth that no longer bleeds, only breathes. What if every time you achieved something, a quiet guilt crept in before the joy could land? Imagine getting the job, winning the award, hearing praise, and your first instinct isn't celebration. It's to shrink, to downplay, to joke, to say, it's not a big deal. Not because you're humble, but because you were trained to feel uneasy in the light. When you grow up around people who view success with suspicion, your brain wires accordingly. Neuroscience shows that the brain's reward system, especially dopamine pathways, can be hijacked by fear-based learning. If, in your formative years, joy was labeled arrogance or abundance triggered envy or punishment, your system starts associating pride with danger. The higher you rise, the more you fear the fall. Maybe you were taught that being too happy would jinx it, that showing pride was selfish, that others had it worse, so your happiness felt like betrayal. Maybe someone close to you resented your wins, so you learned to hide them. Now, when good things happen, you soften them with disclaimers. You dim the light so others aren't uncomfortable, even if it means living your whole life in a shadow you didn't choose. Psychologists call this a success guilt complex, often rooted in trauma, survivor's guilt, or cultural conditioning. It's the inner tug of war between thriving and belonging. But joy doesn't make you cruel. Success doesn't make you selfish. You don't owe smallness to anyone. So next time you want to shrink after a win, pause. What if the world needs your light visible, not buried? What if joy isn't arrogance? What if joy is proof you survived and permission for others to rise too? What if every sorry you whispered wasn't guilt, but fear disguised in politeness? Imagine walking into a room and apologizing for being in someone's way, even when you're not, or saying sorry when someone else bumps into you. This is the over-apologizing reflex, an emotional habit rooted not in wrongdoing, but in anxiety, in the deep-seated need to keep the peace at any cost. It's not about fault, it's about control, because blame, even when misplaced, feels more stable than the chaos of uncertainty. If you're to blame, then at least there's an answer. Psychologists link chronic over-apologizing to early environments where emotional safety was conditional. If love was withdrawn after mistakes, or worse, unpredictably handed out, your nervous system learned to preempt conflict by accepting blame, fast, often, even when it wasn't yours. The brain, through neuroplasticity, forms apology loops. The amygdala, our threat detector, flares with any perceived disapproval, and the word sorry escapes before we register what we're apologizing for. It's not etiquette, it's survival. Over time, this reflex becomes a mask. You say sorry to avoid confrontation, to fill silences, to soothe others' discomfort, but in doing so, you often erase yourself. Healing begins when you notice how often sorry becomes your punctuation. When you ask, am I apologizing for existing or for crossing an invisible rule someone else taught me? You don't need to stop being kind. You just need to stop bleeding for cuts that aren't yours. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can say is nothing at all. And when that silence holds, when you resist the reflex and simply breathe, you start to hear something underneath, your actual voice, not the rehearsed reflexive one shaped by fear, but the one that's been waiting to speak without permission, without apology. That voice is yours.
Location-based triggers. What if a street, a hallway, or the scent of a stairwell could constrict your chest without warning? Imagine walking through a quiet neighborhood or entering a familiar room, and suddenly your breath shortens, your pulse quickens, but your mind can't explain why. This isn't random. It's a location-based trigger, a physical reaction rooted in implicit memory. Your body recalls what your mind has long buried. Neuroscientific research confirms that the hippocampus, which stores contextual memory, and the amygdala, which processes emotion, often work together to link physical spaces with emotional responses. You may not remember what happened there, but your body does. And yet, most people dismiss these reactions as irrational, but the body doesn't lie. In trauma recovery, therapists often use exposure therapy or somatic tracking to decode these spatial responses. The brain might forget, but the nervous system is a recorder without a pause button. Every footstep echoes with a feeling your brain thought it outran. Emotional mapping is real and often invisible. One hallway might feel suffocating, while another feels sacred. And the difference isn't logic, it's lived experience encoded in muscle and breath. So the next time a place feels heavy without reason, pause. Don't force clarity, just ask, what part of me once felt unsafe here? Because sometimes, healing isn't found in remembering, but in listening. Your body already knows the truth. All it's waiting for is acknowledgement. And maybe, for the first time, compassion in the place where panic once lived. Because when the body finally feels safe, the past begins to loosen its grip. What if your brain practiced comfort the same way dancers rehearse steps? Imagine lying in bed, eyes closed, and picturing someone holding you. Not someone who ever did, but someone who never has. You imagine their voice, their warmth, their arms around you, not because you were delusional, but because your nervous system is starved for safety. This is comfort rehearsal, a form of imagined caregiving where your mind tries to simulate what your body never received. Neuroscience shows that visualization activates many of the same brain regions as real experience. The brain, in moments of deep need, becomes a theater. You create scenes not to lie to yourself, but to regulate. When there are no hands to hold you, imagination becomes the next best thing. A whisper replayed, a gaze constructed from memory or fantasy. These mental rehearsals aren't weakness, they are resilience. You picture someone brushing your hair, saying, "You're okay now," even if no one ever did. You replay a scene where someone sees you cry and stays, not because it happened, but because your nervous system needs to know it could. These are emotional blueprints, templates for a reality you have never lived, but still long for. And maybe you don't talk about it. Maybe it feels too strange to say out loud that sometimes the softest touch you've ever known is one you imagined. But it mattered. It gave your body something to hold on to. You're not broken for needing scenes that never happened. You're building safety from the inside out, teaching your body what the world forgot to offer. And sometimes, that imagined hug is what keeps you breathing through nights that feel endless until the real one finally comes. What if your obsession with productivity isn't ambition, but fear? Imagine sitting down to rest, no deadlines, no emails, no tasks, but instead of peace, your chest tightens. Guilt creeps in. You start scanning for something to do. That's not drive. That's survival mode dressed in achievement. This is productivity as self-worth. The belief that if you're not producing, you're not enough. Psychologists link this to what's called contingent self-esteem, where your sense of value depends on outcomes. It's not just a bad habit. It's a defense mechanism. If praise, safety, or love were once conditional on being useful, your brain starts associating rest with risk. And in that equation, doing becomes armor. You clean when you're overwhelmed. You plan when you're sad. You fix others so you don't have to feel broken. Society rewards this. Gold stars, paychecks, compliments like, "You're so driven." But no one sees the panic beneath the planner, the exhaustion behind the smile. You're not resting because part of you believes that stillness equals failure. Neuroscience shows that chronic busyness activates stress circuits, overloading cortisol, impairing memory, and dulling emotion regulation. The very thing you think keeps you afloat may be dragging your mental health under. And yet, when you try to stop, the silence feels unsafe. Your worth starts unraveling the moment the work stops. Healing means uncoupling identity from output. It means asking, who am I when I do nothing? And learning to sit with the discomfort of that answer. Because real peace isn't earned, it's remembered. You were always worthy, even in stillness, especially in stillness. And the hardest work sometimes is doing nothing and still believing you matter. What if your love for constant noise isn't a preference, but armor? Imagine falling asleep not to melodies, but to the drone of fans, the hum of a TV, the loop of a podcast you've memorized. Not because it entertains you, but because silence feels like a trap door. In silence, your mind speaks. And for some, that's the scariest sound of all. Neuroscience tells us that the brain's default mode network, responsible for self-reflection and memory recall, activates most strongly in stillness and quiet. Without distraction, the brain begins to retrieve unresolved emotions, old pain, lingering regrets. This is why, for many, nighttime silence doesn't bring peace. It brings flashbacks. Maybe you grew up in a home where yelling filled the air, and now silence feels unnatural. Or maybe silence was the background to neglect, a vacuum where you were left to process pain alone. Over time, your nervous system adapts. It seeks noise not as stimulation, but as safety, a wall between you and your own thoughts. The hum becomes a shield. The sound becomes survival. This is what psychologists call noise dependency, a coping mechanism often rooted in trauma, anxiety, or unprocessed grief. The noise isn't soothing, it's numbing. It doesn't comfort you. It blocks what you're not ready to feel. And yet, it works. For a while. Until the silence catches up to you in other ways: fatigue, tension, restless dreams, and a constant hum of unease beneath the surface. So, the next time you press play to avoid the quiet, pause. Not to punish yourself with silence, but to ask, what am I protecting myself from? Because healing doesn't always start with sound. Sometimes it begins in the spaces we're most afraid to hear. Sometimes it begins with listening inward. What if your own reflection felt more dangerous than any stranger's stare? Imagine brushing your teeth, fixing your hair, passing a hallway mirror, and never looking up. Not really. Not long enough to catch your own eyes. Because there's something about sustained eye contact with yourself that threatens to unravel the whole act. This is more than habit. It's a form of emotional avoidance, a self-preservation tactic wired into the nervous system when authenticity feels unsafe. Neuroscientifically, mirrors create what's called self-recognition processing, centered in the right prefrontal cortex. For most, it confirms identity. But for those with unresolved trauma, shame, or dissociation, mirrors feel like interrogation devices. You avoid the eyes because that's where truth hides. One locked gaze might expose the exhaustion, the pain, the pretending, and so you look past yourself. You perform normal. You keep moving. Because stopping, even for a second, means admitting something you're not ready to face. Studies show that people who experience chronic stress, depression, or complex PTSD are less likely to engage in mirror self-confrontation. It's not vanity, it's survival. Avoiding the mirror is avoiding the judgment you think might live there. And sometimes it's not judgment, it's recognition of the person you once were, or the person you've lost, or the one you've become and don't yet know how to forgive. But healing begins in milliseconds. The first moment you dare to meet your own eyes and not flinch. To see, not the mask, but the human beneath it. To say silently, I'm still here. Because sometimes, eye contact with yourself is the bravest kind. And sometimes, it's the first time you feel real. What if your brain stages a funeral, not because someone died, but because they didn't reply? Imagine waiting for a text, a call, a single sign. And when silence stretches too long, your mind begins rehearsing grief. You picture their face in a casket, hear the eulogy in your own voice, even feel the ache of losing them forever. It's not melodrama, it's survival logic, emotional rehearsal for abandonment. Psychologists call it anticipatory grief, a coping strategy where your brain simulates loss to dull the shock of possibly experiencing it for real. It sounds extreme, but it's more common than we admit. In childhood, if love was unstable or unpredictable, your brain learned to prepare for vanishing acts. Now, as an adult, a late response triggers the same circuitry as loss. So, you run the scenario not out of drama, but as preparation. Research in attachment theory shows this isn't madness, it's memory. Secure attachment calms uncertainty. Anxious or avoidant attachment magnifies it until imagination becomes mourning. And because grief rehearsed feels less brutal than grief ambushed, you let your mind write the worst-case script before the silence ends. But here's the truth. Imaginary funerals don't protect you, they only exhaust you. So the next time you catch yourself crafting a tragedy, just because someone didn't answer, pause. That story you're building isn't prophecy, it's a shield. Your brain's way of controlling what it fears most, vanishing without warning. You're not broken, you're bracing. But there's another path. Wait, breathe, and remind yourself they're not gone. This moment is just a pause, not a goodbye. And sometimes, silence just means busy. What if love, for you, became less about connection and more about disappearing? Imagine being in a relationship where your first instinct isn't to share yourself, but to shrink. You don't lie, exactly. You just dim. You suppress your preferences, mute your emotions, rewrite your desires, not to manipulate, but to maintain peace, to keep them from leaving. This is self-erasure, and it starts small. You pick the restaurant they like. You cancel plans for their convenience. You laugh at jokes that sting. You say, "It's fine," when it's not. You stop bringing up your dreams because they roll their eyes. And slowly, your needs become ghosts. Not because you don't have them, but because you've trained yourself to believe they're a threat to love. Psychologists link this to fawning, a trauma response where survival depends on appeasement. You convince yourself being easy to love means asking for less, but over time, you forget what you like, what you want, what you feel. You stand beside them, smiling, but something's missing. Not because they took anything, but because you handed parts of yourself away, piece by silent piece. And now, there's a hollowness they can't fill, because it was shaped by everything you erased. You wonder why you feel so alone with someone right there, why their affection doesn't touch you. It's not distance, it's absence, yours. You didn't lose yourself all at once. You gave yourself away hoping it would be enough. But the truth is, real connection doesn't require disappearance. It requires presence. And you deserve to be fully here, without shrinking, without editing, without vanishing to be loved. You deserve to take up space and still be chosen. What if "I'm fine" isn't a statement, it's a reflex? Imagine someone asking how you are. The words come out automatically. I'm fine. Even if your chest is tight, even if you haven't slept, even if you're barely holding it together, you say it because it's safer than the truth. This is I'm fine programming, an emotional autopilot built over years of hiding pain for the sake of survival or social ease. Psychologists describe this as emotional masking, when your outward expression is intentionally disconnected from your internal state. It often starts in childhood, where vulnerability might have been punished, ignored, or simply too dangerous. So, you learn. Honesty costs connection. You adapt. You become fluent in pretending. Over time, I'm fine becomes a shield and a prison. You use it to protect others from your discomfort, to avoid being a burden, to keep control. But the cost is high. Chronic emotional suppression can increase anxiety, weaken the immune system, and even disrupt memory. And yet, silence feels easier than explaining why you're not okay, especially when you're not sure yourself. You say it until it becomes your truth, or until they stop asking. And when they do, part of you feels relieved. The other part feels more alone. That's the paradox of I'm fine. It keeps you hidden, then punishes you for being unseen. You smile so others don't ask. You laugh so they won't look deeper. Healing starts with disruption, with answering differently, even quietly. I'm tired. It's been rough. I don't know yet. Small truths crack open the mask, and in those cracks, connection grows. Not everyone deserves your truth, but you do. And the moment you stop hiding from your own pain, you give others permission to do the same. What if laughter isn't always joy, but camouflage? Imagine standing in a room full of people, tears pushing behind your eyes, but you crack a joke instead. Everyone laughs. The moment moves on. And no one asks what you were really feeling. That's the point. You don't joke because it's funny. You joke because it's safer than explaining the ache behind your ribs. Psychologists call this humor as a defense mechanism. It's especially common in people with complex trauma or emotional neglect. Studies show that humor activates the brain's reward centers, releasing dopamine and temporarily reducing stress. But when it's used to mask vulnerability, it becomes more than entertainment. It becomes survival. A shield forged in childhood, when crying earned punishment, or silence was misread as weakness. Maybe you learned early that your sadness made others uncomfortable, that emotions needed translation. And jokes? They were a language everyone understood. So, you became fluent in deflection. You laughed off heartbreak, cracked sarcasm during anxiety, performed comedy over pain. You smiled so well that even you started to forget what you were hiding from. But suppressing emotion with laughter doesn't erase it, it buries it. And buried pain doesn't disappear, it leaks. Into your relationships, into your sleep, into the mirror you avoid when no one's watching. Healing doesn't mean you stop being funny. It means your laughter isn't the only voice you're allowed to use. So, next time you feel a joke rising like a reflex, pause. Ask yourself, am I laughing or am I hiding? And what might happen if, for once, you let someone see the story behind the smile? What if love didn't feel safe, but suspicious? Imagine someone reaching for your hand, speaking softly, offering closeness, and your chest tightens. Not because you don't want affection, but because somewhere deep in your wiring, love is linked to pain. This is the trauma reflex of trusting rejection over love. You flinch, not from lack of desire, but from a lifetime of training, of learning that warmth often ends in withdrawal, that tenderness, once trusted, can slice deeper than cruelty ever could. This isn't about being cold, it's about being conditioned. Neuroscience shows that attachment wounds, especially in childhood, alter how the brain encodes safety and threat. The amygdala becomes hypervigilant, reading even kind gestures as precursors to pain. You brace for betrayal because betrayal is what came next last time. It's not just emotional, it's chemical. Cortisol spikes. Oxytocin feels foreign. Intimacy becomes a trigger instead of a balm. In relationships, this reflex plays out quietly. You might pull away when things get too good, sabotage closeness, pick fights, or numb out during moments that should feel warm. Not because you don't care, but because your nervous system is screaming, "This isn't safe." And sometimes, it's easier to leave than to hope and be hurt again. It's not rejection you trust, it's the pattern you remember. Healing doesn't start with accepting love. It starts with trusting your own body again, with noticing the flinch and pausing, with asking, is this fear from the past or something true in the present? Because eventually, the goal isn't to stop fearing love, it's to walk toward it even while afraid. That's what courage looks like in healing, reaching out anyway. What if your search history wasn't curiosity, but crisis control? Imagine diving into articles about anxiety, trauma, or attachment theory, not just to learn, but to delay the emotional storm rising beneath the surface. You study your problems like a scientist, not to fix them immediately, but to keep them at arm's length. That distance is a survival tactic. When emotions threaten to overwhelm, knowledge becomes a buffer. It's not denial, it's containment. It's the way you hold chaos in a jar labeled research. This behavior has roots in cognitive psychology. Intellectualization is a known defense mechanism, turning emotional turmoil into academic inquiry. By shifting focus to data, theories, and definitions, the brain avoids the full weight of feeling. It buys time. That's why people in deep distress can often speak clinically about heartbreak or grief. They're translating pain into structure. Information becomes a temporary shelter when raw emotion feels like a tidal wave crashing against the walls of your chest. You bookmark pages on emotional regulation, you memorize symptoms of depression, you collect facts instead of collapsing. Because falling apart without a framework feels fatal. You don't want pity, you want patterns, something you can decode and manage. But the truth is, research isn't the end. It's a bridge. At some point, the knowledge must turn inward. The textbook closes, and the silence comes. That's when healing starts, not in knowing what pain is, but in finally letting yourself feel it. So, if you're studying yourself like a case file, know this. You're not cold. You're cautious. You're not distant. You're building a landing strip for the truth. Let it land. You're ready.
What if forgetting wasn't failure, but protection? Imagine remembering every apology that didn't match action, every compliment that came too late, every birthday you celebrated for someone who forgot yours. That kind of memory becomes heavy, corrosive, so your mind edits, not because it's broken, but because it's tired of bleeding. Selective forgetting isn't weakness, it's peacekeeping. Neuroscience shows that chronic stress reshapes the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory. Your brain learns to filter, to preserve your emotional bandwidth, so you forget dates, you forget details, you forget the warmth in their voice when they said they cared, because remembering it only highlights how cold they feel now. This isn't denial, it's a boundary drawn in silence. You start dropping names from your mind, skipping over events you used to treasure, not to be cruel, but to survive. The mind, when overwhelmed, does what it must to protect the heart. You let go of the good because the contrast to the bad is too sharp. You forget the nice things they once said because holding on to them feels like betrayal now. You forget smiles turned to silence, laughs that led to pain. And yet, people call you distant, cold, as if not remembering is a crime. But they don't see the archive you burned just to breathe again. Forgetting becomes a ritual, a way to clear space, to choose what echoes in your head. You're not heartless, you're healing. One empty shelf at a time, one skipped date at a time, one name erased in mercy. Selective forgetting isn't the absence of love. It's what happens when memory becomes a wound, and peace means letting it go before it cuts deeper than you can bear. What if your silence in crowds isn't fear? It's calculation. Imagine stepping into a room. Before you speak, your eyes scan. You register who's laughing, who's withdrawn, who's watching whom. You notice the subtle cues, the crossed arms, the micro glances, the too loud voice. This isn't social anxiety, it's signal scanning, a survival strategy masked as caution. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a heightened state of sensory sensitivity often rooted in early environments where reading the room was necessary for safety. Maybe you grew up in a house where moods shifted suddenly, or with people whose reactions were unpredictable. So your brain adapted. You became fluent in body language, tone shifts, eye flickers. You learned to listen before speaking, assess before acting. This isn't weakness, it's an evolved form of emotional intelligence, but it's also exhausting. Because your nervous system is always on, always decoding, always preparing. Even in safe places, your mind maps invisible threat levels. Not because there is danger, but because there was. And your body doesn't forget. You might appear quiet, guarded, even cold. But inside, you're conducting a full diagnostic of everyone in the room. Your silence isn't emptiness, it's observation. Your hesitation isn't shyness, it's strategy. Healing doesn't mean turning this skill off. It means learning when to turn it down. To tell your nervous system, this moment is safe. You don't need to scan for landmines in every smile. You can exist without decoding every breath, and sometimes, the boldest thing you can do is walk in, speak first, and trust that safety isn't something you have to earn. It's something you deserve. What if your darkest jokes weren't about darkness at all, but about survival? Imagine joking about death, about the vast meaninglessness of the universe, about oblivion, and people laugh or flinch. But they rarely realize you're not trying to shock them. You're trying to shrink the panic that would consume you if you didn't name it first. This is the existential numbing reflex. It's what happens when your brain touches the edges of meaninglessness too often, so it builds a defense out of irony. Neuroscience shows that when the amygdala senses threat, even abstract ones like death or purposelessness, it floods the system with fear. But humor can hijack this response. When we laugh, even bitterly, the brain releases endorphins. The horror becomes manageable. The abyss becomes a punchline. Maybe you discovered this young. Maybe death came close, through illness, loss, violence, or just thinking too hard at 2 a.m. And instead of being crushed by the weight of "what's the point?", you learned to spin it into something others would mistake for wit. You became fluent in cosmic sarcasm. You joked about oblivion so it couldn't swallow you first. You made laughter into armor, irony into air. Psychologists call this a form of defensive detachment, a way to feel less by narrating more. But numbness isn't peace, it's exhaustion. It's the nervous system holding its breath indefinitely. And left unchecked, it becomes a personality. You start to believe you don't care. But the truth is, you care so deeply, it threatens to undo you. So next time you laugh at the void, pause, not to stop, but to notice. Under the punchline is a truth. You've seen the abyss, stared into it with trembling humor, but you're still here. And that, more than any cosmic answer, might be enough. What if your full calendar wasn't ambition, but armor? Imagine waking up and filling every hour with chores, calls, meetings, noise, not to achieve, but to outrun something quieter, something heavier. Free time feels like a trapdoor, an invitation for everything you've buried to rise. So you keep moving, you keep working, not because you're driven, but because slowing down might let the pain catch up. This is the psychological defense known as overfunctioning. Common in those with unresolved trauma, grief, or chronic anxiety, it manifests as productivity obsession, not out of joy, but as a coping mechanism. The nervous system, trained to associate stillness with emotional flooding, pushes you into motion as survival. The prefrontal cortex stays active, helping you plan, execute, distract. But beneath that effort, the amygdala whispers, "Don't stop. You won't like what catches you if you do." And so, you clean when you're tired, overwork when you're sick, say yes to things you resent. You blur boundaries, lose sleep, and feel guilty even on weekends. Stillness becomes foreign. Rest becomes a threat, because in stillness, there's space for memory, for grief, for the voice that says, "You're not okay." But acknowledging that would mean breaking the illusion, and you're scared the pieces won't go back together. Healing begins not with clearing the calendar, but with tolerating silence, with letting 5 quiet minutes pass without checking a screen, with noticing the panic and breathing anyway. Because the truth is, you're not lazy. You're exhausted from outrunning a collapse, and maybe, just maybe, stillness isn't the enemy. Maybe it's the place where you finally get to heal. What if your cleaning spree wasn't about cleanliness, but about staying afloat? Imagine feeling sorrow welling up, and suddenly you're scrubbing the sink, rearranging the bookshelf, or vacuuming with a kind of desperate focus. This isn't just habit, it's a survival pattern. You move your body so your mind doesn't drown. It's biology masquerading as productivity. When stillness feels like sinking, motion feels like control. Psychologists call this behavioral activation, a way to counter emotional paralysis through physical action. But there's more. When emotions threaten to flood your system, movement gives the nervous system an anchor. Organizing becomes a ritual of control in a moment of internal chaos. You fold socks to fold time. You mop floors to mop grief. You line up jars in alphabetical order not to please your eyes, but to soothe your nervous system. You don't even notice you're doing it until it's done, until the emotion subsides just enough to breathe. Research shows that repetitive tasks like cleaning can soothe the amygdala, the brain's fear center. It's not that dust matters, it's that movement gives the brain a rhythm, a pattern, something predictable when everything else feels uncertain. Trauma survivors often report bursts of cleaning or physical restlessness as a way to quiet overwhelming inner noise. And it works, temporarily, until the stillness returns. And when it does, it brings everything with it. So if you find yourself moving faster when your thoughts get darker, know this: you're not escaping. You're translating. You're converting emotional weight into kinetic energy. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. You're trying to outrun the wave with your feet still on the ground, but when the floor is spotless and your chest still aches, pause. Let stillness speak. Because some feelings don't need scrubbing, they just need space to be seen. What if your mind kept a hidden shelf for every kindness you've ever received? Imagine it. A glance held longer than necessary, a coffee handed to you without asking, a text that simply said, "I'm thinking of you." You store them, not out of sentimentality, but survival. You archive affection like artifacts, because some part of you expects warmth to vanish. This isn't nostalgia, it's emotional scaffolding. When your self-worth crumbles, you reach back for evidence that you mattered, that once someone saw you, that once you were enough. Psychologists link this to low self-esteem rooted in emotional inconsistency. When love was uncertain, your brain started building its own record, tiny moments of proof that you weren't as unlovable as you feared. You remember the exact tone someone used when they praised your work, the way a friend hugged you tighter without asking why, the time someone defended you when you couldn't find the words. You save these like emotional receipts, not to brag, but to breathe. Because when shame floods in, when the voice in your head grows cruel, you open that mental drawer and remind yourself, love did touch you. You were real to someone. But here's the ache. Sometimes, that archive feels more real than your current reflection. Because you're still waiting for new kindness to arrive, still terrified it won't. So you hoard old warmth, rehearse past comfort, and cling to moments that once made you feel invisible. You're not weak for holding on to scraps of tenderness. You're proof that even the smallest kindness can echo louder than cruelty. You don't archive affection because you're broken. You do it because you know how much it truly saved you. What if the smile you flash in photos isn't celebration, but survival? Imagine someone pointing a camera at you. You lift your chin, widen your eyes, curve your mouth, click. You look fine. You look radiant even. But inside, you're splintering. That smile isn't a memory, it's a mask. This is smiling in photos while breaking, and it's more common than we admit. Psychologists recognize this as emotional dissonance, where your outer expression directly contradicts your inner reality. Smiling in distress isn't performative, it's protective. If you've ever had to hold a family together or endure pain you weren't allowed to show, the camera becomes a test. And your smile? It's armor, a controlled performance, a shield against questions you don't have the energy to answer. The corners of the mouth rise, but the eyes? They stay haunted. That's where the truth leaks out. Because the human face has over 40 muscles for expression, and the brain is wired to detect when they don't match. We call it the Duchenne marker. A real smile moves the eyes, a fake one doesn't. People can't always name it, but they feel it. A strange ache behind the eyes in a photo that should have felt joyful. You look back at those pictures and wonder how you looked so okay. You show them to others and say, "That was such a good day." But it wasn't. You were just good at pretending, good at surviving. That's the story your mouth tells. I'm still here. But healing begins when we stop needing the smile to prove we're okay. When we allow our face to rest. When we take photos not for proof of joy, but as witness to truth. And one day, your smile won't be armor. It'll be real. Not because you fought to wear it, but because you no longer had to. What if the songs you post say what you're too scared to write? Imagine scrolling late at night, picking lyrics that aren't just beautiful. They're bleeding. You copy, paste, and hit share. Not with an explanation, just the words. If someone looks closely enough, maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll see you without you having to say anything at all. This is what psychologists call indirect emotional disclosure, a way to express vulnerability while staying protected. Neuroscience tells us that when we feel threatened by emotional exposure, the amygdala activates, warning us of social risk. But art, especially music, offers a loophole. Songs let us outsource our truth. It's not you saying it. It's just a quote, just a lyric, just a playlist. But you know what you meant. Maybe you grew up where vulnerability was dangerous, where emotions were dismissed or punished. Maybe being honest got you hurt, ignored, or laughed at. So now, you translate pain into melody, grief into rhythm, longing into harmony. Because direct language feels like standing unclothed in a storm. But a song? A song gives you shelter, a shield made of someone else's voice and pain that mirrors your own. And sometimes someone replies, "I love that song." But they don't know they just touched a scar. They don't know that the chorus you chose was your confession, because lyrics are safer than letters, safer than cries for help. But the truth? They're still cries, echoes of what you couldn't say out loud. So next time you post a lyric, ask yourself, am I hoping someone hears me? Because maybe it's not just a song. Maybe it's the only way you've learned to say, "This is me, please listen, please understand." What if your body breaking down wasn't your greatest fear, but a secret wish? Imagine being so overwhelmed that your mind starts fantasizing, quietly, guiltily, about getting sick, a flu, a minor accident, anything that would force the world to pause, not for sympathy, not for drama, but for the only kind of rest that feels allowed. This is the illness as escape blueprint, a deeply misunderstood psychological pattern where exhaustion seeks refuge in physical collapse. It's not malingering, it's not weakness. It's the result of a nervous system pushed beyond its threshold, where the only acceptable excuse to stop is illness. Chronic overfunctioners, perfectionists, and those raised in environments where rest was labeled lazy are most prone to this reflex. The brain, seeking relief, begins imagining socially sanctioned ways to shut down. Cortisol floods the system. Immunity lowers. And sometimes the body listens. Because psychological pressure can become physical strain. Studies in psychosomatic medicine show a link between unprocessed stress and immune suppression. It's why burnout mimics flu symptoms. Why caregivers get sick only after the crisis ends. Why the thought, "I wish I'd just get sick," flashes like lightning in the mind, then disappears under shame. But it matters, because it's a sign. Not that you want harm, but that you need help urgently. Healing starts when you stop waiting for illness to give you permission. When you learn to rest without needing a breakdown to justify it. When you listen to the first whispers of fatigue instead of waiting for the crash. Because real rest shouldn't come wrapped in suffering. And you don't need to earn stillness through pain. What if your thoughts kept rewriting a moment, not to remember it, but to erase it? Imagine replaying a conversation, a fight, or a silence over and over. Not because it changed anything, but because you didn't like how you showed up. So you edit it. You change your tone. You rewrite your lines. You imagine standing up for yourself, saying what you really meant. And for a second, the memory softens. But it never disappears. This is the rewrite loop, a mental survival tactic where your brain obsessively replays past events in an attempt to fix them after the fact. It's part self-critique, part fantasy, and fully exhausting. Psychology calls this rumination. But more specifically, it's emotional time travel. You try to change what hurt by altering your memory's script. But memory doesn't work that way. The past isn't a draft. It's permanent ink, etched into the emotional circuits of your nervous system. You think, if I just find the perfect reaction, maybe I'll stop feeling ashamed, or small, or invisible. But each mental revision only deepens the groove. You become trapped in loops of imagined bravery that never touched reality. Research shows this kind of rumination is linked to anxiety, low self-esteem, and trauma, especially when a person felt powerless in the original moment, so they rewrite it again and again, hoping to reclaim agency they didn't have back then. It's not weakness. It's mourning for a power you needed but didn't yet have. But no rewrite changes the event. Only the present can. So if you catch yourself fixing the past in your mind, try asking, what needs fixing in me now? Because healing doesn't live in edits. It lives in new endings, in showing up today with the courage you once rehearsed in silence, in choosing to forgive the version of you who froze, who fumbled, who survived the only way they knew how. What if wanting less wasn't growth, but grief? Imagine once dreaming with your whole heart, big hopes, loud wishes, futures drawn in color. Then life answers with silence, or worse, cruelness. And slowly, hope stops feeling bright. It starts to feel dangerous. So you shrink your dreams, not because you matured, but because you learned the cost of wanting too much. It hurt. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When repeated disappointment trains the brain to stop expecting good things, your system wires itself for damage control, not possibility. You no longer reach far, not because you can't, but because you remember the burn of empty hands. You tell yourself you're realistic, grounded, but deep down, you're just trying to stay safe from collapse. You stop talking about the career you wanted. You downplay the relationship you hoped for. You pretend the small version of life is enough. You act like comfort was always the goal. And everyone says you're humble. But inside, you feel folded, compressed into a shape that doesn't reflect who you were. Because every time you let yourself want something big, reality slapped it out of your reach. The bruise deepened. Now, you aim lower, want quieter, love cautiously, because less desire equals less pain, right? But here's the hidden wound. When you teach yourself not to want, you also teach yourself not to believe, not to try, not to feel alive. You didn't change. You adapted. You traded dreams for armor. But deep inside, the version of you that once dared still exists, watching, waiting. Maybe what you need isn't to give up hope, but to forgive yourself for how much you wanted more, and give yourself permission to want again. What if your delayed replies aren't rudeness, but regulation? Imagine your phone lights up. A message appears. You read it, maybe even smile, but you don't respond. Not yet. You wait, not to play games, not to punish, but to stay in control. This is the message delay reflex, a psychological pause that feels like power when connection feels uncertain. Psychologists link this to emotional regulation and attachment patterns. If you've experienced abandonment, rejection, or inconsistent attention, your nervous system may associate instant replies with vulnerability. To respond quickly is to surrender emotional footing. But waiting feels safer, strategic, like you're the one who gets to end the scene. It's not always conscious. You might tell yourself you're busy or that you'll reply later with more energy, but beneath it is a quieter truth. You want to feel unshaken. Replying too fast feels like handing over proof you care more. And if you've ever been ghosted, ignored, or breadcrumbed, you know how painful that imbalance can be. So the pause becomes protection, a way to reclaim your side of the story. But the cost is distance, missed moments, misunderstood intentions. They may think you're cold, aloof, detached, but inside, you're just trying not to feel too much, too fast. You're not avoiding connection, you're rationing it, trying to make closeness feel less risky. But in doing so, you often delay the very intimacy you crave. Healing starts by noticing the impulse, asking what you're afraid will happen if you answer now. Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't silence, it's showing up in real time, letting someone know they mattered when they mattered. Because control might feel safe, but connection is what we're built for. What if your emotional extremes weren't a flaw, but a pressure valve? Imagine feeling everything: grief, joy, anger, anxiety, all crashing at once like a storm surge inside your chest. And then, suddenly, nothing. Just numbness. Not peace, not calm, just silence where the chaos used to be. People might call you inconsistent, but they don't see the flood. They only see the drought that follows it. This is the emotion bottleneck reflex. Psychologists describe it as a form of emotional dysregulation caused by unresolved trauma, high stress sensitivity, or neurodivergence. When too many feelings rush in at once, your brain and nervous system become overloaded. There's no space to process. So everything shuts down. It's not apathy, it's overflow. It's your system throwing a circuit breaker to avoid emotional collapse. Neuroscience shows that during emotional flooding, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, the center for rational thought and regulation, goes offline. Your body enters survival mode. Crying, screaming, or even feeling can feel dangerous. So your system hits the emergency brakes. You disconnect. You go blank. But deep down, the storm still churns, still crashes against the walls. Maybe you've been told you're too sensitive, that you overreact or shut down for no reason. But there is a reason. You were never taught how to feel safely. So now your feelings arrive like a traffic jam. Too much, too fast, then total gridlock. And when the jam finally clears, you're left drained, empty, and wondering if anyone else lives this way. So next time your emotions flood and fade, don't apologize for the pattern. Recognize it. You're not broken. You're bottlenecked. And healing doesn't mean forcing calm. It means learning how to widen the channel and let yourself flow. What if every push you gave wasn't rejection, but a question you didn't know how to ask? Imagine nudging someone away, not to lose them, but to see if they'll reach back. A late reply, a cold tone, a moment of silence, not out of malice, out of fear. This is the love testing reflex, a subtle, unconscious pattern where the fear of abandonment creates tiny trials. If they care, they'll prove it. If they don't, at least you were braced for the fall. Psychologists link this to attachment insecurity, especially in those who experienced emotional unpredictability early in life. When love felt inconsistent, offered and withdrawn without warning, you learned to test it, not by asking directly, but by creating distance. The anxious brain watches closely. Will they notice? Will they fight to stay? It's not manipulation. It's longing wrapped in armor. The amygdala remembers every time someone walked away. Now, it warns you. Don't believe love until it's proven under pressure. But here's the trap. Testing love can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people feel pushed too hard, too often, they may stop trying. And that's when you whisper, "I knew it," even if part of you is breaking. You say you're hard to love before anyone else can. You write your own rejection to avoid surprise, because if you're the one who predicts pain, maybe you can dull the blade when it arrives. Healing begins when you name the reflex, when you admit the push was a plea, when you risk asking directly, "Do you really care?" and let the answer arrive without distortion. Because love isn't proven in chase, it's revealed in presence. And safety comes, not when someone pulls harder, but when you finally stop running. What if the truth you tell isn't really the full truth, but the version you've rehearsed? Imagine opening up about your trauma, but doing it with a smile, with polished timing, with the kind of rhythm that keeps people from looking too closely. You've said it so many times, it sounds like a monologue. Safe, scripted, perfectly edited for comfort. Not yours, theirs. This is truth as performance, a defense mechanism shaped by pain and precision. When your real story was once met with discomfort, dismissal, or disbelief, your brain learned to refine it, to package it, to make it palatable. You choose what to share, how to say it, and where to pause so it lands well, because applause, or at least acceptance, is safer than silence. And if they clap, maybe you'll feel seen. But performance isn't the same as connection. Psychologists refer to this as emotional distancing. By turning trauma into narrative, you gain a sense of control. But that control often comes at a cost. The deeper wounds stay buried beneath the script. Vulnerability becomes choreography. Authenticity gets edited. And the pain remains untouched, just performed. You speak the truth, but only the version that's been sterilized. Studies show that people who've experienced repeated invalidation or rejection often learn to mask their emotions through storytelling. It's not deception, it's survival. But if you're always curating your pain, who's hearing the truth? Not the audience, not even you. So if your truth sounds rehearsed, ask yourself, what part of the story are you still protecting? Because real healing doesn't need applause, it needs honesty, messiness, the unscripted kind. The kind that trembles when spoken, the kind that finally stops pretending it doesn't hurt. What if your politeness wasn't kindness, but fear dressed in yes? Imagine hearing yourself agree, nod, comply, while something inside you begs to stop. You don't say no, not because you don't feel it, but because you've trained yourself to delay it. This is the boundary delay reflex. When you avoid conflict by abandoning your own limits, thinking that tolerance is the same as peace. Psychologists trace this to fawning, a trauma response where safety is earned by submission. You believe being agreeable keeps people calm, keeps situations smooth, but it comes at a cost. Every unspoken no becomes a pressure point. You absorb discomfort to prevent theirs. You suppress your needs until your body starts protesting in other ways. Headaches, anxiety, exhaustion. The peace you think you're keeping is a ticking silence. You say yes to favors you don't have time for. You let someone vent long past your emotional bandwidth. You smile while your boundaries erode. You call it compassion, but it's self-erasure. Then one day, something small breaks the surface, and all the yeses collapse into an overdue explosion. People are shocked. They say, "Why didn't you say anything?" But you did, just not out loud. Boundaries aren't walls. They're bridges that teach others where to meet you. Saying no isn't cruelty, it's clarity, it's courage. Each delayed no stores resentment like a time bomb. When it goes off, no one remembers the 1,000 times you were silent, only the moment you finally snapped. You're not too sensitive. You're not selfish for needing space. You deserve to speak your no in time, calmly, clearly, before it becomes your scream. You don't need permission to protect your own peace. What if going silent during conflict isn't indifference, but overload? Imagine a heated argument. Voices rise, emotions boil, but instead of fighting back, you go blank. Your words vanish. Your thoughts blur. You stare, nod, or walk away, not because you don't care, but because your nervous system just hit its limit. This is the emotional shutdown reflex. Psychologists call it dissociation or dorsal vagal shutdown, a physiological response to perceived threat. When fight or flight isn't safe or possible, the body chooses another path: freeze. It's not weakness, it's biology. If you grew up around volatility or chaos, your system may have learned that going still is the safest escape. So now, when arguments escalate, your mind detaches as a way to survive intensity. To the outside world, it looks like stonewalling. But inside, it's collapse. Your brain dims the lights. Your body dulls sensation. You're not avoiding the issue. You're trying to stay afloat. And later, when things calm, shame often sets in. Why couldn't I say what I felt? Why did I shut down? You replay it, wishing for stronger words, forgetting that your silence was strength in disguise. This reflex can affect relationships deeply. Partners may feel ignored or dismissed. Friends might think you're cold. But the truth is, you were protecting your most fragile circuits. You weren't absent. You were overwhelmed. You shut down not to escape the person, but to survive the moment. Healing starts by recognizing the signal, by gently reconnecting to your body in those moments. A breath, a grounding touch, a reminder, I'm safe now. Over time, the shutdown loses its grip, and your voice, once drowned in survival, learns it has room to return, not as defense, but as presence, as truth, as you. What if your intuition wasn't vague? It was your earliest alarm system. Imagine walking into a room and feeling it tighten. Nothing is said, nothing looks different, but your stomach knots, your pulse shifts. Something invisible is off. And hours later, the truth arrives. Someone was angry, hiding something, or unsafe. You didn't have the facts, but your body already knew. This is what psychologists and neuroscientists call neuroceptive awareness. Your brain's unconscious ability to detect safety or danger before logic catches up. The vagus nerve, part of your parasympathetic nervous system, scans for threat below awareness. It reads tone, posture, micro-expressions. You feel the vibe long before you understand the details. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Maybe you developed this sensitivity in childhood, reading moods before words, because words lied, but tension didn't. Maybe you lived in a home where emotions were explosive or absent, and learning to scan the room kept you safe. You weren't guessing, you were surviving. People might say you're too sensitive or reading into things, but the truth is, you've been trained by experience to listen for the signal beneath the surface. You notice what others miss, the hesitation in a voice, the shift in eye contact, the silence that's too loud, and you trust your gut even when your mind has no proof. This isn't superstition, it's survival intelligence. You navigate the world by energy, not explanation. And while you may struggle to justify why you flinch, withdraw, or brace yourself, your nervous system is already doing the math. So next time you sense the room change, trust it. Vibe over detail isn't a weakness, it's wisdom. Your body remembers what the mind forgets. What if hope felt like danger, not relief? Imagine everything finally going right, love, work, peace, and instead of joy, you feel tension. A breath held, muscles tight. Because you've learned that the fall always follows the flight. This is hope muted by habit, a survival pattern formed in the nervous system where optimism feels reckless, where expecting good things becomes a setup for pain. So you expect the worst, even when life is kind. This reflex often comes from environments where safety was unpredictable, childhoods where good moments were always interrupted, where laughter came before yelling, where kindness masked control. The body remembers. The brain adapts. The amygdala stays on guard. Even during calm, your system scans for threat. It's not pessimism, it's preparation. Hypervigilance masquerading as realism, dressed up as wisdom. Studies in trauma psychology show that those with complex PTSD and chronic anxiety often struggle to trust peace. Good moments trigger alarms. The brain associates stillness with ambush. You downplay hope, detach from excitement, sabotage ease. Because control is safer than surprise, it's why you imagine bad news during happiness. Why you rehearse disaster just in case. Because the fall hurts less if you never let yourself rise. But healing isn't forcing joy. It's learning to survive safety, letting your body slowly unlearn the rhythm of tension. It's whispering, "This is okay," in moments of calm, and not flinching when it lasts longer than expected. Because the truth is, not all quiet hides a storm. Not every rise must end in ruin. Sometimes, good things stay. And hope, when practiced gently, becomes a skill instead of a risk. What if every behavior you once hated about yourself wasn't failure, but survival? Imagine looking back at the things you called flaws: your people pleasing, your silence, your sharpness, your jokes in serious moments. Now imagine they were blueprints, emergency exits built by your nervous system, a quiet genius beneath the chaos, helping you survive things you never fully named. This isn't just poetic, it's science. Neuroscience shows that trauma wires us to adapt fast. Hypervigilance, that was pattern recognition. Emotional shutdown, that was a circuit breaker. Avoidance, that was navigation. Every reaction you thought was broken was actually brilliant under pressure. You didn't know the rules. You just built responses, and they worked because you're still here. In psychology, this is called adaptive functioning. It means the behaviors you picked up were never random. They were crafted by experience, necessity, and instinct. You found ways to bend in high winds, even if no one saw the storm. And while those tools may not serve you now, they got you through then. Your reflexes weren't mistakes, they were maps. Not elegant, maybe, but effective. But survival strategies aren't forever. They were never meant to be homes, only shelters. And now, the shelter creaks. The tools feel heavy. The mask doesn't fit. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you've outgrown the emergency. And when you feel yourself reaching for old defenses, it's not regression, it's memory. So the next time you feel shame for how you used to cope, pause. You survived without even knowing how, and that means something extraordinary. The system worked. Now, healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about honoring the architecture and learning how to build without fear.